In the 41st millennium, hope is a lie whispered by madmen, and compassion is weakness that feeds the enemy. For 10,000 years, the imperium of man has clawed its way through an existence of endless war, sustained only by zealotry, brutality, and the corpse light of a dying god. Into this darkness, where mercy is heresy and kindness invites damnation, something impossible arrived. Something that still believed in saving everyone. The auger arrays of Cadia's orbital defense stations detected it first, an object moving at impossible velocity, trailing energy signatures that made tech priests weep with confusion. No warp signature, no engine burn, just kinetic force that defied physics, cutting through the void like a bullet through flesh. The trajectory calculations predicted impact in the Kasser-Tyrock wastes, far from the primary hive cities but dangerously close to the Cadian 8th Regiment's forward staging grounds. Colonel Dmitry Karamazov watched through magnoculars as the object struck Earth 30 kilometers distant. The impact should have vaporized everything within a 100-kilometer radius. Instead, a pillar of dust rose, almost gentle, and when it cleared, the crater was barely 50 meters wide. Something had arrested its momentum at the last possible instant. "Vox the Inquisition," Karamazov ordered, his voice steady despite the dread coiling in his gut. "Unknown Xenos landing. Possible warp contamination. Requesting immediate support." The response came within the hour. Inquisitor Helena Vex of the Ordo Xenos arrived aboard a Valkyrie gunship, her power armor gleaming with purity seals, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the crater below. She was young for an Inquisitor, barely 60 standard years, but her record spoke of ruthless efficiency. 17 worlds purged, 400,000 heretics burned. She would suffer no alien to live. Karamazov's Chimera transport rumbled across the blasted landscape, flanked by 3 Lehman Russ battle tanks and 2 squads of stormtroopers. The Cadian 8th didn't take chances, not even with the Inquisition present. As they approached the crater's edge, Vex raised her hand and the convoy halted. In the center of the crater, something stood. It was humanoid. That much was clear, but impossibly perfect. Tall, perhaps 2 meters, with a physique that suggested strength beyond even the Emperor's Space Marines. It wore strange garments, blue fabric tight across its torso, red fabric flowing from its shoulders like a cape, and a symbol emblazoned on its chest. A stylized, angular shape in red and yellow that resembled no Imperial Aquila or Xenos glyph Vex had ever encountered. The being's skin was pale, its hair black as the void, and when it turned toward them, its eyes, Emperor preserved them, its eyes were blue. Not the cold blue of Fenrisian ice or the sickly blue of warp taint. These eyes held something Vex had only read about in ancient texts from before the age of strife. They held kindness. "Please," the being said in flawless low Gothic, its voice carrying across the wasteland with unnatural clarity. "I mean no harm. I don't know where I am, but I can help you. Whatever you're fighting, whatever threatens you, I can help." Vex's augmetic eye cycled through threat assessment protocols. Energy signatures, off the charts, biological markers, unknown, psychic resonance, negative, but something else, something her instruments couldn't classify. The being radiated power like a plasma reactor, yet it stood there with its hands open, empty, vulnerable. "Identify yourself, Xenos," Vex commanded, her hand resting on her bolt pistol. Behind her, 40 lace guns aimed at the stranger's chest. "My name is Clark Kent," the being replied. "I'm from Earth. I was fighting someone, dark side, when something went wrong. There was light and tearing, and now I'm wherever this is." He looked up at the sky, and Vex followed his gaze. Cadia's sun hung blood-red on the horizon, and above it, the Eye of Terror split the heavens like a wound in reality itself. Clark's expression shifted. Horror, recognition of something fundamentally wrong. "What happened to your sky?" he whispered. Karamazov barked a laugh devoid of humor. "That, Xenos, is the price of our survival. That is what 10,000 years of war looks like. That is home." Clark floated, a meter off the ground, and every stormtrooper tensed. Vex's hand tightened on her weapon, but she didn't draw. Not yet. The being drifted upward slowly, His gaze locked on the eye of terror, and she saw something in his face that made her chest tighten with an emotion she'd thought burned out of her decades ago. She saw grief. "How many?" Clark asked, his voice barely audible. "How many people live under that?" "Trillions," Vex replied, "across 1 million worlds. All of them in the Emperor's light, all of them fighting for humanity's survival against the Xenos, the heretic, and the demon." Clark descended back to the crater floor. His hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. "Then I'll help," he said simply. "Whatever you're fighting, however I can. No one should have to live like this," Vex laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You don't understand, Xenos. You don't help us. You submit to interrogation, confession, and probable execution. You are an unknown variable in a galaxy where the unknown kills. You will be cleansed." "I'm not a Xenos," Clark said, and there was steel beneath his gentle tone. "I'm human, just not from here, and I'm not submitting to execution when I can help you." Karamazov opened a Vox channel. "Fire on my mark." Before he could give the order, Clark moved. One instant he was standing still. The next he was 20 meters away, and the ground where he'd stood erupted with laser gun fire. He hadn't run. He'd simply been somewhere else, faster than human eyes could track. "Please," Clark said, his voice carrying impossible distances. "I don't want to fight you, but I will defend myself. Let's just talk. I can prove I'm not a threat." Vex held up her hand, forestalling another volley. Her instincts screamed heresy, but her curiosity, the same curiosity that had made her an inquisitor, demanded answers. This being spoke of help, of saving people. In the 41st millennium, such words were either madness or heresy, or something far more dangerous, something forgotten. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions where impossible heroes challenge the grimdark reality of the 41st millennium, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to what happens when hope itself becomes a weapon. Because Clark Kent is about to discover that in this galaxy, compassion doesn't just make you weak, it makes you the most dangerous thing alive. The interrogation chamber aboard the Hammer of Righteousness was designed to break minds. Psychic dampeners hummed in the walls, their null field generators creating a void where even the strongest psychers felt their souls shriveling. Servitors, lobotomized humans grafted to machinery, stood motionless in alcoves, their surgical tools gleaming under harsh lumens. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and fear sweat accumulated over centuries of questioning. Clark sat in the reinforced restraint chair, adamantine shackles securing his wrists and ankles. He could have broken them with a thought, but he'd allowed himself to be bound. Cooperation he'd learned in his first hour aboard this vessel was the only language these people understood as non-threatening. Inquisitor Vex circled him slowly, her augmetic eye whirring as it cycled through scanning protocols. Behind her, a hunched tech priest, Magos Septimus Kroll, muttered binaric cant while his mechadendrites probed the air around Clark's body, sampling radiation signatures. "Your genetic structure," Vex said, her voice clinical, "is mostly human. Bipedal, carbon-based. DNA analogs that match Terran baseline within 92% parameters. But the remaining 8%, she paused, consulting a data slate. The remaining 8% is utterly alien. Your cellular structure absorbs and stores electromagnetic radiation with impossible efficiency. Your bone density exceeds ceramite. Your musculature operates on principles that violate every known law of biology." "I'm Kryptonian," Clark replied patiently. He'd explained this 3 times already. "My species evolved under a red sun. When we're exposed to yellow sun radiation, our cells—" "There are no yellow suns in this sector," Vex interrupted. "Cadia orbits a red dwarf. The Eye of Terror's warp bleed corrupts stellar radiation across 17 subsectors. Yet you claim to draw power from solar energy you cannot possibly access." Clark hesitated. She was right. Ever since he'd awakened in that crater, something had felt wrong. His powers were there. He could feel them thrumming beneath his skin. But they flickered. When he'd moved at super speed to dodge the laser gun fire, it had taken more effort than it should. His X-ray vision phased in and out. His hearing, usually capable of detecting a heartbeat from continents away, was limited to perhaps a kilometer. I feel weaker here, he admitted. I don't know why. Maybe the radiation is different. Maybe there's something in the atmosphere. But I'm still strong enough to help you. Magos Kroll spoke, his voice a metallic rasp filtered through Vox grills. Hypothesis: the subject's bioelectric field interfaces poorly with local space-time geometry. The immaterium's proximity creates quantum interference patterns. Additionally, blessed null field generators aboard this vessel suppress anomalous energy signatures. Conclusion: the Xenos operates at diminished capacity within our holy confines. I'm not a Xenos, Clark said again, frustration creeping into his tone. I'm human, just from somewhere else. Another Earth. Vex leaned close, her human eye narrowing. There is only one holy Terra, only one cradle of mankind. Your claim of alternate origins is either ignorance or heresy. Which is it? It's the truth. Clark met her gaze steadily. Where I come from, Earth is protected. There are heroes, people with abilities like mine, or technology, or just courage, who fight to keep people safe. We don't execute aliens on sight. We don't lobotomize our own citizens and turn them into those things. He gestured toward the servitors. One of Vex's stormtroopers stepped forward, raising his hellgun. You dare insult the Emperor's mercy? Servitors are granted purpose beyond their sinful flesh. They serve the Imperium in death as they failed to in life. Clark's jaw tightened. That's not mercy. That's horror. Vex waved the stormtrooper back. You speak of a reality where humanity is soft, pampered, protected by heroes who indulge in mercy and compassion. Such a reality could not exist, Clark Kent. Such weakness would have been devoured by the darkness millennia ago. She gestured toward a viewing port where the eye of terror churned, visible even through the ship's armored hull. Look at what opposes us. Demons born of emotion itself. Alien horrors that consume worlds. Ancient machines that harvest souls. Green-skinned barbarians who exist only to wage war. The tyrannid swarms that devour entire star systems. She leaned closer, and Clark saw something in her human eye. Not cruelty, but exhaustion. Soul-deep weariness. We are cruel because we must be. We execute Xenos because they would execute us. We bind our psychers and burn our heretics because the alternative is demonic possession and worlds turn to screaming nightmares. Every measure you find horrific, we take because 10,000 years of history has proven that mercy kills, compassion damns, kindness invites annihilation. Clark absorbed her words and, for the first time since arriving, he felt true fear. Not for himself, but for the truth he saw in her eyes. She believed every word. More than that, she lived it. This wasn't theoretical philosophy. This was survival doctrine written in the ashes of countless failed civilizations. I understand, he said slowly. I understand that you've suffered, that you've lost more than I can imagine. But I can't accept that cruelty is the only answer. There has to be another way. Then you are naive, Vex replied. And naivety in the 41st millennium is fatal. Magos Kroll's mechadendrites retracted with a pneumatic hiss. Inquisitor, I have completed preliminary analysis. The subject's biological signature does not match any cataloged Xeno species. Genetic markers suggest Terran origin, albeit impossibly divergent. Recommendation: further study before termination. The Omnissiah may grant revelation through this anomaly. Vex considered this, then nodded slowly. Very well, but you will be monitored, Clark Kent. Every moment, every action. One sign of corruption, one hint of warp taint or Xeno sympathy, and I will personally deliver your execution. She moved to the door, then paused. Colonel Karamazov reports increasing chaos cult activity in Kasser Tyrok's underhive. Traitor guard elements and demon worshippers. We purge them at dawn. You claim you can help? Prove it. The shackles released with a magnetic clunk. Clark stood, rubbing his wrists, not because they hurt, but because the gesture seemed human, expected. I'll help, he said, but I won't kill anyone who can be saved. Vex's laugh was cold. In the underhive, Clark Kent, there is no one left to save, only heretics who have chosen damnation. You will learn this. or you will die learning it. As she left, Clark stared at the viewing port. The eye of terror stared back, a cosmic wound bleeding madness into reality. Somewhere in his chest, beneath the flickering power that sustained him, he felt something settle. Determination. He'd faced Darkseid, Doomsday, Brainiac. He'd stared down threats that would have broken worlds. This universe was darker, crueler, more broken than anything he'd encountered. But he was still Superman, and Superman didn't give up. Even when hope itself was heresy, the Valkyrie gunship descended through Kasser Tyrock's industrial smog, its engines screaming against thermals rising from promethium refineries. Clark stood in the troop bay, surrounded by 12 stormtroopers whose hellguns never wavered from his center mass. Inquisitor Vex occupied the command throne, her fingers dancing across tactical displays that showed the Underhive's labyrinthine depths in red wireframe. The cult calls itself the Amaranthine Truth, Vex explained over the Vox beads she'd grudgingly provided Clark. They preach liberation from the Emperor's light, promise freedom through chaos. 3 months ago, they numbered perhaps 50. Now our estimates place them at over 2,000, spread across 17 sublevels. Clark watched through the viewport as they passed descending hive layers. The upper spires gleamed with wealth, Gothic architecture reaching toward poison skies, nobles living in relative comfort. The middle hives were industrial warrens where workers lived and died in the Emperor's name, their lives measured in production quotas. But the underhive was hell. Structures collapsed into structures. Makeshift dwellings clung to ancient foundations like tumors. Bioluminescent fungi provided the only light in places where the sun had never reached. Millions lived down here. The forgotten, the failed, the fallen. People born, lived, and died in darkness, knowing only that somewhere above them, the Emperor's servants deemed them unworthy of even basic dignity. "How many civilians are down there?" Clark asked. "Irrelevant," Vex replied. "Once chaos takes root, there are no civilians, only vectors of corruption. We purge the infected levels and seal them with plasma charges." Clark's hands tightened on the crash webbing. "You're going to kill thousands of innocent people because some of them joined a cult? They are not innocent once they harbor heretics. Chaos spreads through proximity, through whispered lies, through the very air. We cannot risk extraction. We cannot risk redemption. We burn out the infection before it metastasizes." The Valkyrie touched down on a landing platform 3 levels above the primary infestation zone. As the ramp descended, Clark's enhanced hearing cut through the industrial cacophony. Screams, chanting, gunfire, and beneath it all, something else. A sound that made his Kryptonian cells recoil instinctively. Laughter that wasn't quite sane. Whispers in languages that hurt to almost understand. He stepped onto the platform and immediately staggered. Pain lanced through his skull like ice picks driven through his temples. His vision doubled, then tripled. For a moment, he saw the Underhive as it was, rusted metal and desperate humanity. Then he saw it as something else wanted him to see it. Writhing with tentacles of unreality, faces forming in shadows, eyes opening in walls that shouldn't have eyes. "Null field dampeners," Vex said, watching him with clinical interest. "Standard issue for anti-psyker operations. They create zones of reality enforcement, suppress warp phenomena. Your reaction suggests your abilities interface with local spacetime in ways similar to psychic powers." Clark forced himself upright, fighting the nausea. His powers hadn't just flickered. They'd nearly shut down completely. His strength remained, but reduced. Maybe 20 times normal human instead of his usual thousands. His speed was merely Olympic rather than faster than light. His invulnerability held, but he could feel impacts now, sense the pressure of gravity in ways he usually didn't. "I can still fight," he said through gritted teeth. "We shall see." Vex gestured, and the stormtroopers formed up. "Our objective is sub-level 17, chamber designate Sigma 9. Cult leadership performs their rituals there. We eliminate them, detonate plasma charges, collapse the level. Standard purge protocol." They descended through access shafts that hadn't seen maintenance in centuries. Rust flaked from walls. Water, or something resembling water, dripped from pipes whose purpose was long forgotten. Clark's X-ray vision phased in and out. giving him fragmentary glimpses of the structure around them. He saw people huddled in spaces barely large enough for human bodies, children sleeping in recycled chemdrums, families surviving on rat meat and hope. These people, he said quietly, they didn't choose this. They're just trying to survive. Survival is earned through service to the Emperor, one stormtrooper replied, his voice emotionless through his helmet's vox grills. Those who fail to earn it are granted the mercy of purposeful death. Clark wanted to argue, but movement ahead cut off his response. A figure stumbled into their torchlight. A woman, perhaps 30 standard years old, though malnutrition made age estimation difficult. Her clothing was rags. Her skin bore the sores of chemical exposure. But her eyes were wrong. The pupils reflected light in colors that didn't exist. When she opened her mouth, too many teeth filled the space, arranged in geometries that hurt to perceive. Her voice was a chorus, dozens of voices speaking in unison, some masculine, some feminine, some neither. The changer of ways welcomes you, pilgrims, the thing wearing a woman's body said. He has shown us visions of your arrival, man of tomorrow. You carry such potential, such delicious uncertainty. Vex raised her bolt pistol without hesitation. Demon host, open fire. Hellguns blaze, their supercharged last beams punching through the woman's torso. She should have died instantly. Instead, she laughed as her wounds sealed with flesh that writhed like maggots. The corridor behind her erupted with cultists. Dozens of them, wearing purple robes marked with 8-pointed stars. They wielded crude autoguns and rusted blades, but they moved with unnatural coordination, as if choreographed by a single malevolent intelligence. Take her alive, Clark shouted, launching forward. He was slower than normal, weaker than usual, but still impossibly fast by human standards. He reached the demon host before the stormtroopers could fire again, his hands closing around her wrists. She burned cold, a sensation that shouldn't exist. And where his skin touched hers, reality fractured. He saw futures splintering into infinite possibilities. Saw himself crowned in darkness, saw himself burning with holy light, saw himself dead, alive, transformed, damned, saved. He threw himself backward, breaking contact. The demon host giggled with a child's voice. You could save them all, man of tomorrow. The architect of fate could grant you that power. All you need do is ask. I don't make deals with demons, Clark growled. Behind him, Vex's stormtroopers advanced, firing in disciplined volleys. Cultists fell, their blood pooling in patterns that seemed deliberate. Clark's super hearing caught their dying words. Prayers not to their dark god, but to the Emperor. Begging for forgiveness. Crying for salvation they'd never receive. They'd been people once, had families, dreams. Then chaos had whispered promises of something better than slow starvation in darkness. Clark moved through the combat zone, pulling stormtroopers out of the line of fire, deflecting bullets with his body. Each impact hurt more than it should. The null field dampeners were everywhere down here, creating zones where his powers waned to almost nothing. But he could still save people, still protect. A cultist, barely 18, eyes wide with drug-induced fervor, charged him with a chain blade. Clark caught the weapon, crushed it with effort that would have been effortless on Earth, and then did something that made every stormtrooper pause. He restrained the cultist without killing him. Don't, Clark said, locking eyes with the young man. Whatever they promised you, it's not worth your soul. You can still turn back. The cultist spat in his face. The saliva hissed where it struck. Acidic, and then detonated the crack grenade hidden in his robes. The explosion threw Clark backward into a support pillar. His uniform was scorched but intact. Kryptonian fabric withstanding what would have vaporized normal clothing. But his chest ached, his ears rang, and when he looked down at the crater where the cultist had stood, there was nothing left but pink mist and the echo of laughter that wasn't the young man's voice. Vex appeared beside him, her power armor's servo motors whining. You tried to save a heretic. He chose oblivion over redemption. This is the 41st millennium, Clark Kent. Mercy kills. Compassion damns. The sooner you learn this, the longer you survive. Clark stared at the bloodstain, at the stormtrooper stepping over it without pause, at Inquisitor Vex's eyes that held no surprise. No sorrow, just grim vindication of a lesson she'd learned long ago. And for the first time since arriving, he wondered if his powers weren't the only thing this universe was stealing from him. They reached sub-level 17 3 hours later, after fighting through 17 ambushes, 2 booby-trapped corridors, and a nest of mutants whose flesh had been reshaped by warp exposure into living weapons. Clark had saved 6 stormtroopers from certain death. 4 others had died anyway, torn apart by cultists who'd grafted chainsword to their own arms, who'd replaced their eyes with targeting augmetics stolen from corpses, who'd chosen damnation so completely that killing them felt like mercy. Clark hated that he was starting to think that way. Chamber Sigma 9 was a cathedral of madness. What had once been a water reclamation facility now served as a temple to forces that defied comprehension. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift when observed directly. 8 pointed stars, spirals that drew the eye inward, equations written in blood that promised revelation to those foolish enough to read them completely. At the chamber's center, 17 cultists knelt in perfect geometric formation around a pit that glowed with light, the color of fever dreams. They chanted in unison, words that made Clark's enhanced hearing recoil, syllables that tasted of copper and regret. And above them, floating in the air like a puppet with invisible strings, was the cult's leader. She had been human once, perhaps a hive worker, perhaps a merchant's daughter. Now she was transition incarnate, her left side still recognizably mortal, her right side transformed into something that existed partially in another dimension. Her right arm ended in fingers that were also feathers, that were also flames, that were also all three simultaneously. Her right eye was a portal into a place where colors existed that human optics were never meant to process. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prescience. Inquisitor Helena Vex, born Hive Volg, orphaned at 7, inducted into the Schola Progenium at 8. Lost your sister to a Genestealer cult when you were 19? That's why you hunt with such fervor, isn't it? Trying to kill enough Xenos to balance the scales, to justify surviving when she didn't. Vex's hand trembled on her bolt pistol. Just for a moment, then iron discipline reasserted itself. I am Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos. My history is irrelevant. You are declared excommunicate traitoris, surrender, and your death will be swift. The cult leader's human eye found Clark, and she smiled with genuine warmth. And you, Kal-El of Krypton, the last son, the man of tomorrow. She tilted her head, and her transformed eyes showed him visions. Earth burning under Darkseid's assault. Lois dying in Metropolis rubble, a future where his compassion had been the weakness that doomed everyone he loved. You wonder if you made the right choices, if your mercy was strength or fatal flaw. Tzeentch can show you the paths not taken. The future's still possible. I don't need a demon's help, Clark said, but his voice carried less certainty than he wanted. Not a demon, the cult leader corrected gently. A god, the architect of fate, the changer of ways. He who sees all possible futures and guides his chosen toward enlightenment. Look around you, man of tomorrow. These people, they were starving, forgotten, left to rot in darkness by an imperium that demands everything and gives nothing. Tzeentch offered them hope, knowledge, power to change their circumstances. She gestured, and the cultists rose. They weren't frothing zealots. They were workers in stained coveralls. A woman holding a child who stared with eyes too old for their face. An elderly man whose augmetic leg had been replaced with a tentacle that seemed more efficient than the original. They looked at Clark, not with hatred, but with desperate hope. You speak of saving people, the cult leader continued. We save ourselves. The Emperor abandons those who cannot serve his war machine. Tzeentch embraces the fallen, grants them purpose beyond mere survival. Is that not heroic? Is that not just? Vex opened a Vox channel. All units, prepare for chamber purge. Seal exits, arm plasma charges. Wait, Clark said, stepping forward. His powers flickered as he moved deeper into the chamber. The null field dampeners warred with the warp energies saturating the space, creating zones where reality itself felt negotiable. These people can still be helped. Rehabilitation, medical treatment. They didn't choose chaos. They were driven to it by desperation. They chose the moment they attended the first ritual, Vex replied coldly. Chaos does not forgive ignorance. It consumes the willing and unwilling alike. These people are already dead. Their souls already forfeit. We grant them the Emperor's mercy by ending their suffering before they become full demon hosts. The cult leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass arranged into melody. Listen to her, Kal-El. She speaks of mercy while preparing to murder everyone in this chamber. Children, elderly, those who only wanted to eat this week. And she calls us evil. Clark's fists clenched. Around him, 17 stormtroopers aimed their hell guns at 17 cultists. One wrong move, one command from Vex, and this room would become a charnel house. He'd faced this choice before. Lex Luthor using human shields, Joker forcing impossible moral calculus. But those enemies had been clearly, undeniably evil. These people had joined a cult dedicated to a dark god. Yes, but they'd done it to survive conditions the Imperium itself had created. If Clark condemned them, wasn't he validating the very cruelty he opposed? If he saved them, would he be allowing chaos to spread? There's always another way, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The cult leader's transformed eye pulsed, and suddenly Clark saw a vision, crystalline and perfect. The cultists purged, their bodies burned to ash, but their souls already tainted, drifting into the warp to feed the very entities the Imperium opposed, their deaths accomplishing nothing except validating despair. Then another path, Clark intervening, using his abilities to evacuate the cultists, placing them in Imperial custody where they could be studied, potentially rehabilitated. But that path ended in fire too. Chaos corruption spreading through the detention facility, stormtroopers possessed. The entire caster lost because Clark had believed in redemption when only annihilation would suffice. A third path, accepting Cincha's offer, power to truly save everyone, to reshape this broken galaxy into something better, all for the small price of his soul. Clark forced his eyes closed, breaking the vision. When he opened them, his heat vision flared instinctively. Twin beams of concentrated solar radiation lanced out, not at the cultists, but at the pit they'd been worshipping. The light, the fever dream, impossible light, erupted in a column of steam and warp energy backlash. The cult leader screamed. Her transformed side writhed, and for just an instant, Clark saw something else looking through her distorted eye. Something vast, something that found him fascinating. Then the moment passed. Plasma charges now, Vex commanded. The stormtroopers moved with practiced efficiency, placing melta-bombs at structural supports. 30 seconds to detonation. Enough time to reach the exits. Not enough time to evacuate the cultists. Clark had to choose, and he realized with horror that tasted like ash that he didn't know which choice was right anymore. Clark moved, not with the blinding speed he'd possessed on Earth, but fast enough. He grabbed the nearest cultist, the woman with the child, and launched toward the exit. The null field dampeners screamed in protest as his biology fought against reality enforcement. Pain spiked through his nervous system like molten wire, but he pushed through it. Stop! Vex's voice cracked over the Vox. You're compromising the purge. Clark ignored her. He deposited the woman and child in the corridor beyond the blast radius, then turned back. 23 seconds. He could save maybe 6 more if he pushed himself. If he ignored the warnings, his Kryptonian cells were screaming about dimensional instability and warp contamination. He reached for the elderly man with the tentacle leg. The cult leader's voice stopped him. Don't you see? You prove my point. You choose compassion even when it damns you, even when it damns them. She gestured at the remaining cultists who stood calmly, watching Clark with expressions of serene acceptance. They don't want your salvation, man of tomorrow. They've already found it. 18 seconds. Clark grabbed the elderly man anyway. The tentacle wrapped around his wrist, not aggressively but firmly. The man's eyes were clear, lucid, completely sane as he spoke. "Let me go, son. I made my choice. Lived 73 years in the Emperor's darkness. Prayed every day to a corpse god who never answered. Then she came." He glanced at the cult leader with something like love. "Showed me that change was possible, that I could be more than what the Imperium decided I was worth. I'm not a victim. I'm free." 12 seconds. "You're infected," Clark said desperately. "Your mind's been compromised. You don't... I know exactly what I'm doing." The old man's grip tightened. "Go save the mother and child if it makes you feel better. But don't insult me by pretending I need saving." Clark released him and sprinted for two more cultists, younger, maybe brothers. He had them halfway to the exit when the first melt-a-bomb detonated. The world became fire and thunder. The concussion wave caught Clark mid-flight, slamming him into a support pillar hard enough to crack the ancient metal. His invulnerability held barely, but the two cultists in his arms weren't so fortunate. The shock wave pulverized them instantly, leaving him holding corpses. He'd been trying to save them, had killed them instead. The chamber collapsed in stages. First the ceiling, then the walls, then the floor, giving way to reveal sub-levels below that hadn't seen light in millennia. Clark caught glimpses as he fell. Vast spaces where thousands more had lived, ancient machinery still humming with unknown purpose, and everywhere, the 8-pointed stars marking chaos corruption that went deeper than anyone had suspected. He arrested his fall 3 levels down, his weakened flight ability straining. Above him, plasma charges continued detonating in sequence, the purge consuming 17 sub-levels in a cascade of controlled destruction. The roar was apocalyptic. Dust and debris filled the air thick enough to choke. Clark's super hearing, functioning in intermittent bursts, caught the screams. Thousands of them. People who'd been sleeping in their hab blocks, working in forgotten factories, living their desperate lives. People who'd had nothing to do with the cult, but who died because they'd had the misfortune of existing below a chaos infestation. He tried to save them, flew through the collapsing levels, pulling people from rubble, carrying children to safety, using his heat vision to cut through blocked exits. But there were too many. His powers flickered with each exertion. The null fields and warp corruption creating interference patterns that reduced him to a fraction of his normal capability. A woman trapped under a fallen girder begged him to save her daughter first. He did, and when he returned, the woman was already gone, crushed by secondary collapse. A child of perhaps 5 reached for him with trust in their eyes. He grabbed their hand, felt it slip from his grasp as the floor beneath them gave way, heard the scream that cut off too suddenly. A group of workers had barricaded themselves in a machine shop. He tore open the door, only to find they'd been dead for hours, poisoned by gas released when the upper levels collapsed. By the time the destruction settled, Clark stood in a crater 3 kilometers wide and 17 levels deep. Smoke rose in columns that disappeared into the hive's upper reaches. Fires burned in exposed promethium lines, and everywhere silence, the terrible silence of mass death. Inquisitor Vex found him there, standing in the ashes, his uniform torn and stained with blood that wasn't his own. 17,000 casualties, she reported clinically, consulting a data slate. Acceptable losses for a chaos purge of this scale. The infection is contained. The cult is eliminated. The operation was a success. Clark turned to look at her. His eyes, those impossibly blue, impossibly kind eyes, had changed. They held something Vex had seen in every veteran of extended campaigns. Something that happened when idealism finally met reality and discovered they were incompatible. "I saved maybe 200 people," Clark said quietly. "Out of 17,000. I had the power to save more, but it wasn't enough. It's never enough here." "No," Vex agreed. "It isn't. Welcome to the 41st Millennium, Clark Kent, where even gods cannot save everyone." She turned to leave, then paused. "The mother and child you evacuated first. Medical teams examine them. Both show stage 2 warp taint. Cellular corruption, irreversible. They'll be executed at dawn, along with the other survivors you rescued, because chaos does not release its grip. even on the innocent. Clark's fist clenched hard enough to crack the ground beneath his feet. No, I won't let you. You cannot stop us. Vex's voice was flat. Absolute. I have 17 stormtrooper companies, 3 Space Marine squads on loan from the Ultramarines, and the authority of the God Emperor himself. You can try to protect them. You'll kill good soldiers doing their duty, and the tainted will still die. Or you can accept that in this galaxy, sometimes everyone loses. She left him in the crater, surrounded by the ghosts of people he'd failed to save. Hours later, as Cadia's blood-red sun set behind the Eye of Terror, Clark heard the gunshots. 17 of them. One for each survivor he'd rescued. One for the mother who'd looked at him with hope. One for the child who'd smiled despite everything. He could have stopped it. Could have moved faster than the execution squad, disabled their weapons, carried the condemned to safety. But to what end? They were corrupted. If not now, then later, they'd transform into something that would kill others. And he'd be responsible. Not the Imperium, not the Inquisition. Him. That night, Superman sat on the hull of the Hammer of Righteousness, staring at the Eye of Terror. The warp rift stared back, a cosmic wound that had been bleeding for 10,000 years, that would bleed for 10,000 more. And for the first time since arriving, Clark Kent wondered if hope itself was the cruelest lie of all. The Tau delegation arrived at Kasser Tyrok 3 days after the purge, their Orca dropship requesting approach clearance with a precision that made Imperial Vox operators suspicious. The Tau didn't visit Imperial worlds without strategic reason, and their timing, arriving just as reports spread of an impossibly powerful alien working with the Inquisition, suggested their intelligence network was more sophisticated than the Imperium wanted to admit. Governor Militant Strakov wanted to deny landing permission and obliterate the Xeno ship. Inquisitor Vex overruled him. If the Tau had come specifically to make contact with Clark, then understanding their interest was more valuable than destroying one delegation. Clark stood in the landing bay as the Orca settled on its landing struts, its hull painted in ochre and white, the colors of the Tau Empire's diplomatic corps. The ramp descended with a pneumatic hiss, revealing 3 figures. The lead Tau was tall by their species' standards, perhaps 1.7 meters, wearing armor that seemed to blend ceremonial artistry with functional protection. Her skin was the blue-gray of dawn sky, her eyes large and luminous. Behind her walked 2 fire warriors, their pulse rifles held in parade rest, but ready to snap to combat position in milliseconds. The ambassador, for that's clearly what she was, approached Clark directly. Ignoring the stormtroopers whose hell guns tracked her every movement, she stopped 3 meters away and performed a gesture Clark's enhanced perception recognized as a formal bow, incorporating elements from 17 different diplomatic protocols. Kal-El of Krypton, she said in flawless, low-Gothic, tinged with harmonic undertones. I am Portwi Tosa Cheashiur. On behalf of the ethereal Supreme Anva, I bring greetings and an offer of understanding between our peoples. My people aren't here, Clark replied carefully. I'm alone. Then you understand isolation, as do we. Shearer's expression, difficult to read on alien features, seemed genuinely sympathetic. The Imperium calls us Xenos, heretics for refusing to worship their corpse god. They have attempted to exterminate us 17 times across our brief history. We survived through unity of purpose, through the Tauva, what you might translate as the greater good. Inquisitor Vex stepped forward, her augmetic eye whirring. You will address all communications through proper Imperial channels, Xenos. The subject is not yours to recruit. Is he yours to command? Shi'ur asked mildly. I understand he saved Imperial lives during your recent purge. I also understand he grieves for the thousands you deemed expendable. She turned back to Clark. The Imperium operates on a simple calculus, survival through brutality. The greater good offers an alternative philosophy. Every life has value. Every being contributes to the whole. We build rather than destroy. We integrate rather than exterminate. You practice mind control, Vex countered. Your ethereal caste uses pheromones and neural conditioning to ensure obedience. You speak of unity, but enforce conformity. We speak of purpose, Shi'ur replied. Is purpose so different from the Imperium's indoctrination? Your Schola Progenium strips children of individuality and shapes them into tools. At least we're honest about our methods? Clark listened to the exchange, his enhanced hearing catching micro-expressions and physiological tells from both speakers. Vex believed her accusations. The Tao's methods genuinely horrified her on some level. But Shior believed her defense just as completely. Both were utterly convinced of their righteousness. "Why are you here?" he asked. Shior produced a data slate. Tao technology, elegant and efficient in ways that made imperial equivalents look crude. "We've been monitoring the warp disturbance that brought you to this galaxy. Our Earth-cast scientists believe it was not random. Something called you here, something that recognized your nature and deemed it necessary." She activated the slate. Holographic projections filled the air, star charts showing the warp's ebb and flow, probability matrices, and at the center, a spike of dimensional instability corresponding exactly to when Clark had arrived. "The 41st millennium is approaching a crisis point," Shior continued. "The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in half. Chaos advances, the Imperium fractures, ancient evils awaken. Your arrival suggests the universe itself is attempting correction, introducing a variable that doesn't fit existing parameters." "You're saying I'm here for a reason?" Clark's jaw tightened. "I don't believe in destiny. People make choices. Then choose to visit our worlds," Shior said simply. "See what the Talva has built. Cities where humans and Tau live as equals. Worlds where suffering is minimized and potential maximized. Judge for yourself whether our way has merit." "It's a trap," Vex stated flatly. "The moment you board their ship, they'll attempt neural reconditioning, turn you into a weapon for their expansion." "We do not need to trick him," Shior replied, an edge creeping into her harmonious voice. "Unlike the Imperium, we have confidence that rational beings given full information will recognize the logical superiority of the Tauva." Clark's mind raced. The Tau's offer was appealing on surface level, a society that claimed to value all life, that built instead of destroyed. But he'd encountered enough utopian promises to recognize potential dangers. Mind control, even benevolent mind control, was still violation of free will. Yet the alternative was staying with the Imperium, an empire built on xenocide and brutal oppression, where 17,000 people died to eliminate one cult, where children were lobotomized into servitors, where mercy was heresy. His powers flickered as internal conflict created bioelectric interference. Since the Underhive purge, something had been wrong. Not just the null fields and warp corruption, something deeper. His cells were adapting to the 41st millennium's stellar radiation, slowly becoming more efficient, but the process was agonizing, like his entire biology was being rewritten one molecule at a time. "I'll visit," Clark said finally, "but on my terms. I come and go freely. No neural conditioning, no pheromones, no manipulation. You show me your society transparently, or I leave immediately." Shior's facial structure didn't allow for human smiles, but satisfaction radiated from her stance. "The greater good requires no deception. Come, Kal-El, let us show you what cooperation between species can achieve when fear and hatred are set aside." Vex grabbed Clark's arm with surprising strength. Her voice, dropped to a Vox channel only his enhanced hearing could detect, carried desperate intensity. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to. The Tau seem reasonable, civilized, even noble, but they expand through cultural assimilation. They conquer minds before worlds. Once you've seen their paradise, you'll want to believe. And that want will destroy you more surely than any demon." Clark met her gaze. "I watched you execute people I saved, children who were infected through no fault of their own. If the Tau's worst crime is making people want to cooperate, that's still better than what I've seen here." Something flickered in Vex's human eye, hurt perhaps, or recognition that he'd identified the exact moral fault line she'd spent decades trying not to examine. "The Emperor protects those who need no protection," she said quietly. "The rest of us do what we must and pray for forgiveness we'll never receive. If you leave with the Xenos, don't expect to return. The Imperium does not forgive those who consort with aliens." Clark gently removed her hand from his arm. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm looking for answers. About why I'm here. About whether this galaxy can be anything except an endless cycle of violence. He walked toward the Orca dropship. Behind him, stormtroopers raised their weapons, but didn't fire. Vex hadn't given the order. The fire warriors tensed but maintained discipline. For a moment, the landing bay held its breath, balanced on a knife's edge between diplomacy and slaughter. Then Clark stepped onto the Tau vessel, and the moment passed. As the Orca lifted off, Clark looked through the viewport at Kasser Tyrok's sprawling hive city, at the crater where 17,000 had died, at the Imperium that claimed every cruelty was necessary, every atrocity justified. Perhaps the Tau would be different, or perhaps they'd just be a different flavor of dystopia. Either way, he needed to see for himself. The Tau world of Tone gleamed like a jewel against the void. Orbital stations arranged in perfect geometric harmony, defense platforms that doubled as solar collectors, and below, continents painted with cities whose architecture seemed to grow organically from the landscape, rather than being imposed upon it. Clark stood in the Orca's observation deck as they descended, his enhanced vision drinking in details that would have required Imperial augmetics to perceive. The cities weren't the Gothic nightmares of Imperial hive worlds. Buildings curved and spiraled with mathematical elegance, connected by transit systems that moved in 3 dimensions. Green spaces, actual living plants, not the toxic fungal growths of underhives, wove through urban centers like arteries carrying life. Beautiful, isn't it? Shira stood beside him. Her posture relaxed in a way that suggested genuine pride rather than propaganda performance. Town was our first colony world beyond our birth system. We've spent 3,000 years developing it. Not exploiting. Developing. The Orca touched down in a landing zone that handled traffic from a dozen species. Clark saw Tau, obviously, but also humans wearing Tau-style clothing, their expressions lacking the haunted desperation he'd seen on Imperial worlds. Crude mercenaries, avian-featured aliens with predatory intelligence, moved cargo with practiced efficiency, Vespid workers, insectoid beings whose wings hummed at frequencies that created harmonic resonance, constructed a new terminal using technology that seemed to blur the line between organic and mechanical. How many species are part of the Tau Empire? Clark asked. 17 auxiliary races have joined the Tauva fully, Shira replied. 43 more maintain protectorate status, autonomous governance under our security umbrella, and humanity. She gestured toward a group of human workers laughing as they shared a meal with Tau colleagues. Over 300 billion humans live within our borders now. Most were refugees from Imperial oppression. Some were entire worlds that chose integration over Imperium brutality. They exited the Orca into air that tasted clean. Actually clean. No industrial smog, no recycled atmosphere with undertones of promethium and despair. Clark's Kryptonian lungs expanded reflexively, and he felt something shift inside him. His powers surged. The alien stellar radiation of Tone's sun, a young yellow star almost identical to Earth's Sol, flooded his cells with energy for the first time since arriving in this galaxy. The constant weakness, the flickering abilities, the sense of operating at diminished capacity, all of it evaporated like morning fog. He rose 3 centimeters off the ground involuntarily before catching himself. His hearing expanded to encompass the entire city. Millions of conversations, the hum of technology, the rhythm of a society functioning in relative harmony. His vision penetrated walls, seeing through structures to the bedrock below, and found none of the nightmare architecture he'd discovered in Kasser Tarok. No torture chambers hidden beneath manufactorums. No corpse starch recycling facilities, processing the dead into food for the desperate. You feel it, don't you? Shira observed. Your abilities returning. The Imperium's warp corruption and null field saturation were suppressing you. Here, in spaces uncorrupted by chaos, you can be what you were meant to be. Clark landed fully, testing his restored strength by pressing his hand against the landing pad's surface. He could shatter it with a thought now. Could move faster than the Tau's sensors could track. Could reduce this entire district to rubble if he lost control. But control was what he did. It was who he was. Show me everything, he said. Not the propaganda, not the parade grounds. Show me where your people actually live. Shaur's expression, he was learning to read Tao microexpressions, registered approval. Transparency is fundamental to the greater good. Come. They spent the next 6 hours touring Tone. Clark saw residential districts where families, Tao and human both, lived in comfortable apartments with access to education, healthcare, and recreational facilities that would have been luxury on Imperial worlds. He visited factories where automation handled dangerous work while sapient beings focused on innovation and quality control. He observed schools where children learn not through brutal indoctrination, but through methods that encourage curiosity and critical thinking. He also saw the cracks. In a human settlement on the city's edge, Clark's X-ray vision caught something the tour hadn't included, a re-education center where humans who'd resisted Tao integration underwent cultural recalibration. The techniques weren't violent, weren't even obviously coercive, but they were manipulative. Psychological conditioning masked as therapy. Neural pathways gradually reshaped through repeated exposure to ethereal pheromones. "What's that building?" Clark asked, pointing. Shaur's harmonious voice developed an edge. "A correction facility. Some humans from Imperial worlds carry trauma responses, aggression, xenophobia, maladaptive behaviors that endanger themselves and others. We help them adjust. By changing who they are? By helping them become functional members of society. Is that so different from your Earth's psychiatric treatment? Or would you prefer we execute them, as the Imperium would?" Clark had no answer. She was right. Some form of rehabilitation was necessary, but the line between treatment and brainwashing felt uncomfortably thin. They ate dinner in a restaurant overlooking the city's central plaza. The food was synthesized but nutritious, designed to meet the dietary requirements of multiple species. Across the plaza, a holographic display showed news from across the Tao Empire. Victories against orc incursions, new colonies established, technological breakthroughs announced. "Your empire is expanding," Clark observed. "How do you choose which worlds to integrate?" "We offer the Tauva to those who suffer under worse alternatives," Shaur explained. "Imperial worlds where populations starve while nobles feast, orc-ravaged systems where survival requires unity. Even former chaos worlds purged and rebuilt. We don't conquer for conquest's sake. We expand because the greater good must expand or be extinguished by those who embrace darkness." "And worlds that refuse your offer?" Shaur's pause was nearly imperceptible. "Are left alone if they pose no threat, are quarantined if they do. The greater good respects self-determination when self-determination doesn't endanger the collective." Translation: worlds that refused integration but remained neutral were tolerated. Worlds that refused and allied with the Imperium or other hostile powers were conquered. The Tao's moral superiority was real but limited, pragmatic rather than absolute. As sunset painted Tao's sky in colors that reminded Clark painfully of home, Shaur led him to a meditation garden where ethereal Onal Town waited. The ethereal was elderly by Tao standards, his skin marked with honor scars from decades of service. When he spoke, Clark felt it, a subtle harmonic that resonated in his chest, that made him want to trust, to agree, to belong. "Kal-El," the ethereal said, his voice carrying weight beyond mere sound. "You are troubled, torn between what you wish the galaxy could be and what you have seen it is. This is wisdom. Only fools are certain." Clark's enhanced metabolism fought against the pheromone influence, burning it away almost as fast as it affected him. But he felt it, understood how insidious it was, how even knowing it was manipulation, part of him wanted to surrender to that sense of belonging. "The Imperium is monstrous," Clark said, "but you're not the answer. You're just a gentler form of control." "Is guidance control?" Onal Town asked. "Is unity oppression?" "We do not deny our methods, Kal-El." The ethereal caste evolved to facilitate cooperation between Tau castes who once warred endlessly. Our influence creates harmony from chaos. Without us, the Tau would have destroyed themselves millennia ago. And the humans you integrate, they didn't evolve to respond to your pheromones. You're hacking their neurology without consent. We're offering them survival, prosperity, and purpose. What does the Imperium offer? starvation, slavery, and death. The ethereal's harmonics intensified. You speak of consent, yet the Imperium gives its citizens no choice. Born into service, live in service, die in service. At least under the Tauva, beings can pursue fulfillment within the greater good's framework. Clark stood, breaking the harmonic influence through sheer distance. You're better than the Imperium. I'll give you that. But better than the worst option isn't the same as good. He turned to leave, but Shiur's voice stopped him. Where will you go, Kal-El? Back to the Imperium that executes children? Into the void alone? You seek a perfect solution in an imperfect galaxy. Such things don't exist. The greater good is the best compromise between idealism and survival. Clark looked back at the city, gleaming and prosperous and built on subtle coercion. Then he looked up at the stars where the eye of terror stained the heavens, even here, billions of light years from Cadia. Maybe there isn't a perfect solution, he said quietly, but I'm not ready to accept that yet. He launched into the sky, his fully restored powers carrying him toward orbit in seconds. Behind him, Shiur and the ethereal watched him disappear. He will return, Town said with certainty, when he has exhausted all other options, when he finally understands that in the 41st millennium, hope itself must be rationed. But as Clark broke atmosphere and felt the solar radiation filling his cells with familiar strength, he made a different decision. He wouldn't accept anyone's solution, not the Imperium's brutality, not the Tau's manipulation, not Chaos's corruption. He would find his own path, even if it killed him. Clark drifted in the void between stars, his body absorbing radiation from Tau's sun as he processed everything he'd witnessed. The silence of space was absolute, peaceful in a way the 41st millennium's inhabited worlds could never be. Here at least there were no screams, no desperate prayers to indifferent gods, no impossible choices between degrees of damnation. His enhanced hearing detected the ship before his vision, a massive vessel moving through real space without warp drive signature. The energy profile was unlike anything Imperial or Tau. Older, colder, mathematical in its precision. A Necron tomb ship. Clark had encountered their kind briefly during his time with the Inquisition. Ancient machines that had once been living beings, now entombed in bodies of living metal. The Imperium considered them existential threats, awakening horrors from an age before humanity reached the stars. The tomb ship's hull was obsidian black, decorated with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and reconfigure as Clark observed them. Gun batteries capable of cracking planets tracked his position with mechanical precision. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a beam of emerald light engulfed him. Not a weapon, a teleportation matrix. Reality folded, and Clark found himself standing in a chamber whose architecture predated human civilization by millions of years. The walls were polished necrodermis, living metal that could repair itself, that existed partially outside conventional spacetime. Geometric patterns covered every surface, their mathematical relationships suggesting purposes beyond mere decoration. At the chamber's center, a figure waited. The Necron was different from the mindless warriors Clark had seen in inquisitorial pick captures. This one radiated intelligence, personality, even sardonic amusement. Its body was crafted from metals that shouldn't be able to coexist, each atom arranged with impossible precision. Green energy flickered in its eye sockets, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that suggested it was speaking simultaneously across multiple dimensions. Kal-El of Krypton, the last sun, the man of tomorrow. The Necron's jaw didn't move. The voice emanated from the air itself. I am Trazyn the Infinite, Archaeovist of Salamis, collector of rarities, preserver of history. And you, my dear anomaly, are the most interesting specimen I've encountered in 60 million years. Clark's fist clenched. I'm not a specimen. Let me go. Oh, I have no intention of adding you to my collection. Yet. Trazyn gestured and hololithic displays materialized, showing Clark's arrival, his time with the Imperium, his visit to the Tau. I've been observing you since you fell from the sky. Fascinating. A being whose existence shouldn't be possible according to this universe's physical laws. Yet here you stand, adapted to local stellar radiation, integrated into local power structures, resisting corruption from entities that have broken stronger souls. The Necron began to circle Clark, its movements unnaturally smooth. Tell me, do you know what you represent? You're not just a dimensional refugee. You're proof that the walls between realities are weakening, that other universes, some better, some worse, all different, are bleeding through into our galaxy. The Chaos Gods know this. The Eldar suspect it. Even the Tyranid hive mind has begun adjusting for multidimensional threats. Why tell me this? Clark asked, tracking Trazen's position while scanning for exits. His X-ray vision revealed the ship's structure. Kilometers of corridors filled with stasis galleries containing specimens from across galactic history. Entire species preserved at their prime. Historical figures kidnapped from pivotal moments and replaced with surrogates. Trazen wasn't just a collector, he was a thief of reality itself. Because I find your moral paralysis entertaining, Trazen replied. You arrive in the 41st millennium with your quaint notions of heroism intact. You encounter the Imperium's brutality and recoil. You visit the Tau's paradise and see its poisoned foundations. Now you drift in the void, uncertain, searching for a path that doesn't exist. The displays shifted, showing futures, probability matrices calculated across billions of variables. In one, Clark allied with the Imperium and became their ultimate weapon, leading crusades that burned entire sectors. In another, he accepted the Tauva and became their symbol. His face on propaganda hollows across their empire. In a third, chaos corrupted him through the simple expedient of offering him the power to genuinely save everyone. You see the pattern? Trazen asked. Every path leads to compromise. Every choice requires accepting lesser evils. The 41st millennium doesn't permit heroes, Kal-El. It devours them and excretes tyrants. Clark's heat vision flared involuntarily, twin beams lancing toward Trazen's chest. The Necron didn't move. The beams struck a dimensional barrier 2 meters from Trazen's position, dispersing harmlessly. Please, I've weathered attacks from transcendent Cetan. Your concentrated stellar radiation, while impressive, is hardly... Trazen paused. His eye sockets flared brighter. Interesting. Your bioelectric field just attempted to phase shift through my defensive chronometry. Your adaptation rate is extraordinary. Give you another month in this universe, and you might actually pose a threat to me. The Necron's tone shifted from amusement to something approaching respect. But I didn't bring you here to fight. I brought you here to offer perspective. You asked the Imperium, why the cruelty? You asked the Tau, why the manipulation? Let me tell you why, from the perspective of one who has watched galaxies rise and fall. The displays change, showing history. The war in heaven, Necrons fighting gods themselves. The fall of the Eldar, an entire species hedonism literally birthing a chaos god. The Rangdan xenocides, alien horrors that nearly exterminated humanity before the Emperor's intervention. The Horus heresy, humanity's greatest hero, becoming its greatest traitor. This galaxy is dying, Trazen stated flatly. It has been dying for 60 million years. Every species that achieves greatness sows the seeds of its own annihilation. The old ones created the warp-capable races and were destroyed by their creation's emotions, feeding chaos. The Eldar built a paradise and birthed Slanesh. Humanity reached for godhood and triggered the Age of Strife. He moved closer to Clark, his presence radiating the weight of eons. The Imperium's brutality isn't sadism, it's triage. Cut away the infected limb before it kills the body. The Tau's manipulation isn't tyranny, it's the only way to make disparate species cooperate against existential threats. Even chaos in its way is logical. Humanity's emotions given form, offering the power to transcend mortality's limitations. That doesn't make any of it right, Clark said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Right. Wrong. These are concepts from a gentler universe. Trazen returned to the chamber's center. Here, there is only survival and extinction. The Tyranids will eventually consume this galaxy. The Necrons will awaken fully and reclaim their ancient empire. Chaos will expand until reality itself becomes a screaming nightmare. The galaxy's death is inevitable. The only question is who survives longest and how much suffering they endure getting there. Clark felt something in his chest. Not physical pain, but the soul-deep exhaustion of someone confronting a problem with no solution. Everything Trajan said aligned with what he'd witnessed. The Imperium's atrocities, the Tau's compromises, the cultists choosing damnation over slow starvation. All symptoms of a galaxy consuming itself. So what? I just give up? He asked. Accept that everything's pointless and wait for the end? No, Trajan said, and for the first time, something like emotion colored his voice. You do what every species has done since the first organic cells divided. You struggle, you fight, you rage against extinction, even knowing it's inevitable. Not because it will change the outcome, but because the struggle itself gives meaning to existence. The Necron moved to a viewing port, gazing at the stars. I collect things, Kal-El. Preserve history because I know eventually all history will be lost. It's futile, meaningless. But I do it anyway because the alternative is accepting entropy's victory before the last battle is even fought. He turned back, emerald eyes blazing. So here's my perspective, offered freely because I find you interesting enough to warrant it. Stop seeking perfect solutions. They don't exist. Stop trying to save everyone. You can't. Instead, decide what you personally can live with, what compromises you'll accept, what lines you won't cross even if crossing them would be pragmatic. Then forge your own path, knowing it will be neither heroic nor entirely moral, knowing you'll fail more often than you succeed, knowing that in the end, entropy wins anyway. Trajan gestured, and the teleportation matrix activated around Clark. But at least you'll fail as yourself, rather than as someone else's tool. Reality folded again, and Clark found himself back in open space, the tomb ship already accelerating away at speeds that violated physics. He floated there, processing Trajan's words. The ancient being had offered no comfort, no easy answers, just the acknowledgement that the 41st millennium was exactly as terrible as it appeared, and that meaningful action was still possible within that framework. Clark looked down at his hands, hands that had held planets, that had fought gods, that had saved millions. Here, those same hands had held corpses of people he'd tried to rescue, had failed to protect children from execution, had proven inadequate against a galaxy's worth of suffering, but they were still his hands, and he still had power. The question was, what would he do with it? Clark's decision to return to Imperial space came not from acceptance, but from pragmatism. If he was going to forge his own path, he needed to understand his capabilities in this universe more completely. And that meant testing himself against the Imperium's finest. He found Inquisitor Vex's ship 3 days later, tracking its warp signature as it translated into real space above a world designated Quintus Severon. The Hammer of Righteousness was accompanied by an entire battle group, 2 strike cruisers bearing the colors of the Ultramarines, a dozen escort frigates, and troop transports carrying what Clark's enhanced vision counted as approximately 50,000 Imperial Guard. This wasn't a purge operation. This was an invasion. Clark approached the fleet at visible speed, broadcasting on all Imperial Vox channels. Inquisitor Vex, this is Clark Kent. I'm requesting permission to come aboard. The response came after a tense 30 seconds, enough time for weapon batteries to track his position and target locks to achieve firing solutions. Permission denied, Vex's voice carried frost. You consorted with Xenos. You abandoned the Emperor's light for alien promises. You are declared excommunicate traitoress. Surrender immediately or be destroyed. Clark sighed. He'd expected this, but hope, even in the 41st millennium, died hard. I'm not your enemy. I'm not surrendering, and you're not destroying me. He accelerated, moving faster than the fleet's auger arrays could track. One moment he was a distant contact. The next he was standing in the Hammer of Righteousness's command bridge. 30 weapons aimed at him instantly. Vex sat in her command throne, power armor fully engaged, her servo skull hovering at her shoulder with its built-in weapons primed. But she hadn't given the order to fire. How did you penetrate our void shields? She demanded. I phased through them, Clark replied honestly. His time drifting in space had given him opportunity to experiment with his power's interaction with 41st millennium technology. Void shields operated by displacing incoming attacks into the warp momentarily. By timing his approach to sync with the shield's displacement cycle and moving faster than their recalibration rate, he'd slipped through the gaps. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to understand what you're doing and offer help if it's warranted. Vex's augmetic eye cycled through threat assessments, each one flashing red. Finally, she waved her soldiers down. You want to help? Then witness the necessity you fled from. She activated the hololith display, showing Quintus Severon in detail. It was an Ultramarines recruitment world, 5 billion humans living under the direct protection of Robout Guilliman's gene sons. Cities gleamed with Mechanicus-blessed infrastructure. Training facilities produced some of the Imperium's finest guard regiments. It should have been a model of Imperial success. Instead, it was falling to chaos. 3 weeks ago, the planetary governor, a man who'd served loyally for 40 years, underwent spontaneous demonic possession, Vex explained, her tone clinical despite the horror of her words. Within hours, 17% of the government was corrupted. Within days, cult activity erupted across 4 continents. Now, she gestured, and the display zoomed to show cities burning. Now we estimate 40% of the population is either actively corrupted or compromised beyond salvation. Clark stared at the numbers. 2 billion people. Corrupted. His jaw tightened. There has to be survivors. People who resisted. We can evacuate them, quarantine the infected. We don't have the resources for that level of extraction, Vex interrupted. We don't have time for quarantine protocols that might fail. Quintus Severon is lost. What remains is preventing the corruption from spreading. The display shifted, showing the fleet's battle plan. It was horrifyingly simple. Orbital bombardment would sterilize the planet's surface. Virus bombs would ensure no biological matter survived. Cyclonic torpedoes would crack the crust, rendering the world permanently uninhabitable. Exterminatus. The complete destruction of an entire world. You're going to kill 2 billion people, Clark said, his voice hollow. I'm going to kill 2 billion vectors of chaos corruption before they become something worse, Vex corrected. Before demons achieve full manifestation. Before the planet becomes a warp rift that could destabilize this entire sector. She stood, moving to stand directly in front of Clark. You visited the Tau. Did they tell you about Daleth? One of their sept worlds, lost to a chaos incursion they tried to rehabilitate rather than purge. 7 billion Tau and auxiliary species corrupted. It took 17 Imperial battle groups and 3 Space Marine chapters to finally cleanse it. The death toll across surrounding systems was 43 billion. She grabbed Clark's arm with surprising strength, her augmetic grip digging in. This is the math of the 41st millennium. Sacrifice 2 billion now, or lose 43 billion later. There are no good choices, only terrible ones and catastrophic ones. Clark pulled free, but gently. What if I could save some of them? The children at least. The ones too young to have been corrupted. Children are the most vulnerable to chaos, Vex said, and her voice carried something Clark hadn't heard before. Grief. Their minds are malleable, their souls bright. Demons prefer children as hosts because they offer decades of usefulness. She turned away. But if you want to try, I won't stop you. You have 2 hours before the bombardment begins. The Ultramarines are deploying to recover their gene seed from fallen brothers. You can accompany them. An hour later, Clark stood in a Thunderhawk gunship surrounded by 5 Ultramarines. Each was a giant, over 2 meters tall in their Mark X power armor, transhuman warriors gene forged from Robout Guilliman's genetic legacy. Their Sergeant Castus had served for 130 years. He regarded Clark with the analytical precision the Ultramarines were famous for. Your capabilities are impressive, Castus said as the Thunderhawk descended through atmospheric fire. But chaos corruption is not a problem solved through strength alone. We have seen brothers who could shatter tanks with their fists fall to whispered temptations. I'm not joining chaos, Clark replied. Everyone believes that, until the moment they don't. The sergeant checked his bolter, the massive weapon designed to fire explosive ammunition that could penetrate power armor. You wish to save children, commendable. But understand, if even one shows signs of possession, They must be eliminated. Mercy to the corrupted is cruelty to the innocent they'll eventually kill. The Thunderhawk touched down in what had been Quintus Severon's capital. The city was a war zone. Buildings burned with warp fire that consumed matter and souls simultaneously. In the streets, citizens fought citizens, some still trying to resist, others fully transformed into chaos cultists whose bodies had been reshaped by dark blessings. And everywhere, demons. Not the subtle corruption Clark had seen in the Underhive. Full manifestations, entities from the warp given temporary physical form. Lesser demons capered through the flames, their forms shifting between states of matter. Greater demons towered over buildings, their presence causing reality itself to fray. Clark had fought monsters before: Doomsday, Darkseid's parademons, Brainiac's war machines, but those had been material threats. These things, these things attacked on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, mental, spiritual. Their very existence was assault on the concept of sanity. A demon turned toward him, a thing of impossible geometry and screaming faces. It spoke, and its words bypassed Clark's ears entirely, manifesting directly in his consciousness. Kal-El, last son, man of tomorrow. You stand at the precipice of choice. Save one child today, and 1,000 die tomorrow through your failure. Save none, and lose your soul to despair. Either path leads to damnation. Choose. Clark's heat vision lanced out instinctively, superheated beams striking the demon's mass. It shrieked, a sound that existed across 17 dimensions, and dissolved back into the warp. But 3 more manifested to replace it. Castus and his brothers advance, bolters roaring, each explosive round blessed by chaplains and inscribed with litanies. The orphanage is 2 kilometers north, the sergeant called over Vox. We move fast, extract what we can, then retreat before the manifestations overwhelm us. They fought through streets that had become nightmare landscapes. Clark used his speed and strength to clear paths, his invulnerability allowing him to shield the Ultramarines from attacks that would have penetrated even their armor. His powers, fully restored under Quintus Severon's Yellow Sun, made him effectively unkillable by conventional weapons. But chaos wasn't conventional. A cultist, a woman whose body hosted something wearing her flesh like a coat, grabbed Clark's cape as he passed. The moment of contact sent visions flooding through his mind. Lois, dead. Jonathan and Martha Kent, burning. Metropolis, consumed. Earth, devoured. All because he'd failed. Because he'd been here instead of home. Because he shattered the connection through sheer force of will, his Kryptonian psychology fighting the psychic assault. The cultist's body collapsed, the demon inside fleeing back to the warp. They reached the orphanage, a fortified structure where 300 children had been sheltering. The Ultramarines breached the doors, and Clark's enhanced hearing caught the sounds inside. Singing, children singing hymns to the Emperor, and underneath, a different sound. Whispers in languages that predated human speech. Castus raised his fist, halting the advance. Auspec's readings show warp taint saturation levels at 93%. The children are already lost. We don't know that, Clark said, pushing past into the orphanage proper. The children sat in perfect rows, 300 of them, ages 5 to 15. They sang beautifully, their voices harmonizing in ways that should have been uplifting. But their eyes reflected things that weren't in the room, colors that didn't exist, futures and past bleeding together. One child, a girl of perhaps 7, turned to Clark and smiled with perfect innocence. "You came to save us," she said in a voice that was simultaneously hers and a demon's. "But we don't need saving. We've been improved." Clark's X-ray vision showed him the truth. Inside each child, nested like parasites, things waited, not fully manifested, not yet, but growing, feeding on the children's souls like larvae in a host. He could feel his heat vision building, ready to cauterize this horror, could feel his strength, capable of ending this mercifully and instantly. And he couldn't do it. These were children. Castus's hand fell on his shoulder. Sometimes the Emperor asks everything of us, even our humanity. The sergeant raised his bolter, and Clark had to decide, stop him and doom countless others, or let it happen and lose a piece of himself that might never recover. Clark's hand shot out, faster than even ultramarine reflexes could track, grasping the barrel of Castus's bolter and bending it upward. The sergeant's finger had already tightened on the trigger. The explosive round detonated against the ceiling, raining blessed ceramite shrapnel across the orphanage floor. "Stand down!" Castus roared, his brothers immediately forming a defensive perimeter, weapons trained on Clark. "You compromised the mission." "There has to be another way," Clark said, his voice strained. He could hear it now, not just the demon whispers, but the children's true voices underneath, small and terrified, crying for help their mouths could no longer form. "They're still in there, still fighting." The 7-year-old girl tilted her head, and for just an instant, Clark saw her, the real her, desperately screaming behind eyes that no longer fully belonged to her. Then the demon reasserted control, and she smiled that terrible innocent smile again. "The War Master offers you a choice, Kryptonian," she said in that doubled voice. "Save these vessels, and we grant them mercy. Let them die, and we consume their souls for eternity. Your compassion becomes our weapon, your strength, our tool." Clark's jaw clenched. It was a trap, the cruelest kind. Save them and damn them. Kill them and lose himself. The kind of impossible choice he'd faced with Lex Luthor's hostage scenarios, but magnified 1,000-fold because here, the stakes were souls, not just lives. "Captain Castus," a new voice crackled over the vox. Deep, authoritative, carrying weight that made even the ultramarine sergeant straighten to attention. "This is Captain Ventress of the 4th Company. We are en route to your position. Hold for reinforcement." Through the orphanage's shattered walls, Clark saw them approaching. 20 ultramarines in full battle plate, led by a captain whose armor bore the scars of centuries of warfare. But it was the figure beside him that made Clark's breath catch. A librarian, a space marine psyker, his armor inscribed with wards and psychic baffles, a force staff crackling with warp energy held in his gauntleted hands. The psychic hood mounted on his helmet pulsed with contained power. Captain Ventress entered the orphanage, his gaze sweeping the scene with tactical precision before settling on Clark. "Stand aside. Librarian Tigurius will assess the situation." The librarian, Tigurius, moved forward with a grace that seemed wrong for something so massive. His psychic presence filled the room like pressure before a storm. When he spoke, his voice resonated on multiple levels simultaneously. "I see the taint. It runs deep, threading through their souls like poison through veins." He approached the 7-year-old girl, and she hissed, her features momentarily distorting. "But you are correct, Kryptonian. They yet resist. The corruption is not complete." Hope, dangerous, painful hope, sparked in Clark's chest. "Can you help them?" Tigurius turned, and behind his helmet's lenses, psychic fire burned. "I can attempt an exorcism, a psychic purging that will drive the demonic essence from their bodies. But understand the cost. Of 300 children, perhaps 30 will survive the process. The rest will die as their souls are torn free of the corruption. It will be agonizing. It will be traumatic. And even those who survive will bear psychic scars for whatever remains of their lives." 30 out of 300, Clark whispered. "That's 30 more than will survive if we do nothing," Ventress interrupted. 30 innocents reclaimed from the dark gods. This is victory in the 41st millennium, Clark Kent. We measure triumph, not in lives saved, but in souls denied to the enemy. Clark looked at the children, 300 pairs of eyes watching him, some pleading, some hungry, all suffering. "Do it," he said. Tigurius nodded. "Then you will help me. Your bioelectric field. It operates on frequencies similar to psychic energy, but uncorrupted by the warp. You will serve as an anchor, a beacon of reality these children can grasp as I pull them free of damnation." The librarian began the ritual, his force staff striking the floor with a sound like thunder compressed into a single note. Psychic energy flooded the orphanage, and Clark felt it, like standing in a hurricane of invisible force. Tigurius chanted in High Gothic, each word reinforced with psychic will, each syllable a weapon against the immaterium. The children began to scream, not with their voices. Those were still singing hymns in perfect harmony. But psychically, spiritually, they screamed as the exorcism tore through them. Clark moved among them, his presence providing what Tiberius had called an anchor. Where he stood, reality asserted itself more strongly. The warp's grip weakened, but not without cost. The demons fought back. They lashed out through their hosts, turning children's bodies into weapons. A 12-year-old boy launched himself at Clark with strength that shattered bones in his own legs from the acceleration. Clark caught him gently, absorbing the impact, holding the thrashing form as Tiberius's power burned the possession away. The boy's screams reached a crescendo, then cut off as his body went limp, not dead, unconscious, breathing, free, one saved, 299 to go. They worked through the night. Tiberius drew on psychic reserves that would have killed lesser psychers, his brotherhood of librarians forming a circle around the orphanage to contain the warp energy backlash. Clark moved tirelessly, catching children as they collapsed, shielding them from demonic counterattacks, providing that stable anchor of uncorrupted reality. But the demons were right. His compassion was their weapon. A girl of 14 held a demon so deeply embedded that Tiberius couldn't extract it without killing her. She looked at Clark with eyes that were still mostly her own and begged him to let her go. "It hurts," she sobbed. "Please, it hurts so much. Just let me die." Clark held her hand as Tiberius made the attempt anyway. Her body seized once, twice, then went still. The demon fled, but took her soul with it. One damned. 37 times Clark watched children die in the exorcism process. Their bodies couldn't withstand the trauma. Their souls, too damaged, simply came apart. Each death was a small eternity of suffering compressed into seconds. And 73 times children transformed mid-ritual. The demons achieved full manifestation, using the children's bodies as doorways. Clark he used his heat vision, precise, instantaneous, cauterizing the wounds in reality before the demons could fully emerge. He told himself he was killing the demons, not the children. He knew he was lying. When dawn broke over Quintus Severon's burning capital, 27 children lay breathing on the orphanage floor. 27 souls reclaimed, 273 dead or damned. Tiberius collapsed, his psychic reserves completely drained. Brother librarians rushed to support him, carrying his armored form to the Thunderhawk. Castus approached Clark, who sat among the survivors, his uniform stained with blood and ash. "You fought well," the sergeant said. Simple words carrying immense weight. "You saved 27, that is 27 miracles in a galaxy that has forgotten what miracles are." "I killed 110, Clark replied hollowly. "Watched another 163 die. That's not a miracle. That's a massacre with a silver lining." "Yes," Castus agreed. He didn't offer comfort, didn't try to soften it. "But the alternative was 300 damned. You chose the less terrible option. This is what heroism looks like here." The Thunderhawk lifted off 30 minutes later, carrying the 27 survivors, 3 dead ultramarines who'd fallen defending the exorcism, and Clark, who stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. From orbit, they watched Quintus Severon die. Virus bombs detonated first, releasing flesh-eating microorganisms that could devour organic matter down to the molecular level. Continents turned gray, then black, as 2 billion people dissolved. Then cyclonic torpedoes struck, cracking the tectonic plates, causing the entire crust to fragment and collapse into the mantle. The planet's death took 6 hours. When it was complete, Quintus Severon was nothing but an asteroid field and a lesson in the Imperium's mercy. Inquisitor Vex found Clark in the observation deck, staring at the debris. "You saved 27, she said. 27 more than I expected. Than anyone expected." "I killed more than I saved," Clark replied. "Yes. Welcome to the 41st millennium, Clark Kent, where even the victories taste like ash. And the only difference between heroes and monsters is whether we can still feel the weight of what we've done." She paused. "But you still feel it. That matters. The moment you stop feeling it is the moment you become what you fight against." Clark turned to face her. His eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, had changed. They held something they hadn't before. Not hardness exactly, but acceptance of a terrible truth. I can't save everyone, he said. No, you can't. But I can save some, and some is better than none. It is. Clark straightened, and despite everything, despite the blood and the failure and the impossible choices, determination flickered back to life in his chest. Smaller, scarred, but still burning. Then that's what I'll do. I'll save who I can, when I can, how I can. I won't accept your way as the only way. I won't join chaos or the Tao or anyone else. I'll forge my own path. And maybe, I can prove that compassion isn't always weakness, that mercy can be strength. Vex studied him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a happy smile, but a smile that held respect. Then you're either the bravest fool I've ever met or something this galaxy desperately needs. She extended her hand. Regardless, you've earned the right to try. Do you accept a formal alliance? Not subservience, partnership. The Inquisition grants you autonomy, and you provide your capabilities when called upon. Clark looked at her hand, at the woman who'd executed children he'd saved, who'd ordered a planet's death, who represented everything brutal about the Imperium, but who'd also given him the chance to try, who'd risked the entire operation to let him attempt the impossible. He clasped her hand. Partnership, but on my terms. I choose which battles I fight. Agreed. Welcome to the War Eternal, Superman. It was the first time anyone in this galaxy had called him that. It wouldn't be the last. 3 months after Quintus Severin, Clark had established what the Imperium reluctantly termed an independent auxiliary force. He operated from a damaged space hulk he'd cleared of genostellar infestation, a massive conglomeration of wrecked ships fused by warp storms into a single structure. Using Mechanicus assistance grudgingly provided by Inquisitor Vex, he'd converted a section into something between a base and a sanctuary. Here, the 27 children from Quintus Severin lived under the care of Imperial medici staff. Here, refugees from worlds too damaged to rebuild, but not corrupted enough to purge, found temporary shelter. Here, Clark tried to prove that a third way was possible. It was a drop in an ocean of suffering, but it was his drop. The Vox alert came at 0300, ship time. Vex's voice strained in ways he'd never heard before. Clark, we have a situation. Orc Wag, descending on Agri-World Thessia Prime. Population, 400 million. Strategic value, critical. It supplies food to 17 hive worlds. Imperial Defense Forces, insufficient. Astra Militarum reinforcements, 6 weeks out. Space Marine support, unavailable. Estimated time until planetary fall, 72 hours. Clark was already moving, pulling on the modified uniform he'd commissioned. Still blue and red, but reinforced with Mechanicus microweave that could interface with Imperial systems. What do you need me to do? Buy time. The Orcs number in the tens of millions. Their war boss, Urgork the Planet Breaker, has conquered 14 worlds in the last 2 years. He's cunning by Orc standards, actually uses strategy beyond charge and kill everything. You won't stop them, but if you can slow them, bloody them enough to make them reconsider easy conquest, reinforcements might arrive before total collapse. Understood. Coordinates? As Clark accelerated toward Thessia Prime, he reviewed what little he knew about orcs. They were fungal organisms, biologically engineered weapons from an ancient war. They grew larger and stronger through combat, their entire psychology oriented around warfare. They felt no fear, experienced joy only through violence, and their collective belief could literally reshape reality. If enough orcs believed something worked, it did. They were also utterly innocent. They'd been created this way, had no choice in their nature. Killing them was like killing a hurricane, sometimes necessary, but devoid of moral complexity. Clark wasn't sure if that made it easier or harder. Thessia Prime appeared as a green and brown jewel in the void, its vast agricultural plains visible even from orbit. But descending toward it, darker colors, the metal and smoke of the Orc invasion. Crude spacecraft, Kilometers-long assemblages of salvaged metal held together by welds and orc conviction disgorged millions of greenskins and drop pods that were essentially armored boxes with rockets. Clark dove into the atmosphere, breaking the sound barrier 17 times as he descended. His target was the largest orc concentration, a landing site where Urgork's flagship, the Smash 'em Good, had embedded itself in a mountain range, disgorging orcs like an infected wound-bleeding pus. He hit the ground at terminal velocity, the impact creating a crater 50 meters wide. Orcs, hundreds of them, turned toward the disturbance. For a moment, there was silence. Then as one, they roared with pure joy. "New fight! Big Hume fight!" one bellowed, a massive creature 3 meters tall, covered in crude armor and wielding a weapon that was part chainsaw, part gun, and entirely lethal. They charged. Clark met them head-on. His first punch liquefied an orc's skull. His second caved in a chest cavity. His heat vision swept across advancing ranks, cauterizing wounds that would have been fatal to humans, but merely slowed orcs. They laughed as they burned, firing crude weapons that sprayed bullets in his direction with terrible inaccuracy, but terrifying volume. It should have been a slaughter. Clark was faster, stronger, more durable than anything the orcs possessed, but there were so many, and they were learning. An orc mech boy, one of their primitive engineers, observed Clark's fighting style for 30 seconds, then assembled a weapon from scrap metal and psychic conviction. He called it a crypto-git blasta, and when he fired it, Clark felt something he hadn't felt in months: pain. The weapon's energy, powered by orc belief that dis should hurt to flying Hume, bypassed his invulnerability partially. Not completely, but enough to matter. The blast sent him tumbling, and orcs dogpiled him instantly, hundreds of tons of greenskin muscle and crude weapons. Clark erupted from the pile, orcs flying in all directions. But his uniform was torn. His shoulder bled. Just a scratch, but it was bleeding. The orcs saw this and roared even louder. "The Hume bleeds! That means we can crump him!" They fought with renewed enthusiasm, and Clark realized, with growing horror, that he was making them stronger. His presence, his resistance, was doing exactly what orcs needed, providing a challenge. Every orc who witnessed him fight grew slightly larger, slightly stronger. Their weapons, crude assemblages that shouldn't function, worked better because they believed they should. He was feeding them. A massive shape emerged from the Smash 'em Good, Gork, the planet breaker himself. The warboss stood 5 meters tall, his body a mountain of scar tissue and cybernetic enhancement. He carried a power claw that could shear through battle tank armor, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hundreds of victories. "So use the Hume everyone's talking about. The one what flies and shoots lasers from his eyes." Gork grinned, revealing teeth like tombstones. "Good. I was getting bored." The warboss charged, and Clark met him in midair. They collided with force that shattered the sound barrier, cratering the ground where they impacted. Gork's power claw closed on Clark's arm, the weapon's power field disrupting molecular bonds, actually damaging Kryptonian cellular structure. Clark gritted his teeth against the pain and drove his fist into Gork's jaw. Teeth flew. The warboss laughed and headbutted Clark hard enough to crack a human skull. Clark's Kryptonian physiology held, but barely. They fought across the battlefield, a whirlwind of destruction that left craters and devastation in their wake. Clark used every technique he'd learned across a lifetime of heroism. Pressure points that worked on humans did nothing to orc physiology. Grappling holds failed against opponents who felt no pain. Strategic strikes to disable rather than kill just made the orcs angrier, which made them stronger. He was forced to kill, not efficiently, not mercifully, but necessarily. His heat vision carved through orc ranks. His freeze breath created fields of frozen greenskins. His strength pulverized bodies into component atoms. And with each death, the remaining orcs grew more enthusiastic. "This is the best fight ever!" one orc screamed before Clark's punch separated his head from his body. Hours passed. Clark fought until his uniform hung in tatters, until his enhanced metabolism struggled to keep pace with energy expenditure, until his Kryptonian cells, even fully powered by Thesia Prime's yellow sun, began approaching their limits. And still the orcs came. Urgork cornered him in a ravine, the war boss's power claw glowing with barely contained energy. "You's good, Humie. Real good. But you ain't orky enough. You fight like you's trying not to hurt us. That's your problem." The war boss was right. Even now, even surrounded by enemies who felt only joy in combat, Clark was pulling his punches, trying to incapacitate rather than kill, holding back his full power because unleashing it would mean genocide. And in that hesitation, he was losing. Urgork's power claw closed around Clark's throat, the energy field burning through Kryptonian cellular resistance. "You could be a good orc, Humie. You got the strength, the speed. If you just stop caring about all them other humies and just fight, you'd be proper orky." Clark's vision narrowed, his hearing focused to a single point, and in that moment, he made a choice. He stopped holding back. His heat vision, unleashed at full power, carved through Urgork's armor like paper. His freeze breath, compressed to maximum intensity, created ice that reached absolute zero in microseconds. His strength, unrestrained, shattered the war boss's cybernetic enhancements with a single strike. Urgork's eyes widened, not in fear but in absolute delight. "Now that's proper orky!" Clark's final punch sent the war boss's body through a mountain. Silence fell across the battlefield. Thousands of orcs stared at the mountain, at the crater where their leader had vanished, at the Humie who stood covered in green blood and breathing hard. Then impossibly, Urgork climbed out of the rubble. One arm missing, half his face crushed, but grinning with pure, uncontained joy. "Dat, what? Amazing!" The war boss stumbled, then fell to one knee. "Oh, aye, boys, this Humie's too good. We needs to get bigger before we fight him again. Back to the ships. We's gonna find more fights, get proper orky, and come back for round two." And just like that, the invasion stopped. Orcs began retreating, not in defeat, but in anticipation. They'd found the promise of a better fight elsewhere. They'd come back when they were stronger, when the battle would be even more enjoyable. Clark collapsed as the last orc ship lifted off. He'd saved Thessia Prime. 400 million people would live to see another dawn. The agri-world would continue feeding 17 hive worlds. He'd done it by becoming exactly what he'd sworn never to become. A killer who stopped holding back, who used maximum force, who'd enjoyed for just a moment the pure simplicity of fighting an enemy that felt no pain, knew no fear, wanted only combat. The orcs had taught him something the Imperium, Tau, and even Chaos couldn't. Sometimes the only answer was overwhelming violence. Sometimes mercy was just prolonged cruelty. Sometimes you had to become the monster to stop worse monsters. And that realization terrified him more than any demon ever could. The summons came from the craft world Ulthway, delivered through methods that bypassed every defense Clark had established. One moment he was alone in his quarters aboard the Space Hulk, reviewing casualty reports from Thessia Prime. The next, a holographic figure materialized, an Eldar Farseer, their wraithbone armor seeming to exist partially in another dimension. Runes floating around them like captured stars. Kal-El of Krypton, the Farseer spoke in Gothic that carried harmonics, suggesting they were simultaneously speaking 17 other languages. "I am Eldrad Ulthrin, Farseer of Ulthway. You have been seen. Your thread in the skein of fate burns with colors that should not exist in this reality. We must speak, immediately." Before Clark could respond, the world twisted. Not teleportation. He'd experienced that. This was something else. Reality unfolding like origami, carrying him along predetermined paths through the webway. The Eldar's ancient network of tunnels through space itself. He materialized on a platform of wraithbone, psychically shaped material that hummed with contained power. Before him stretched Craftworld Ulthway, a city-sized vessel that had traveled the stars for 10,000 years. It was beautiful in ways that made Imperial architecture look crude and Tau construction sterile. Every structure flowed into the next with organic grace, decorated with runes that told stories in colors humans had no names for. And everywhere the Eldar watched him, tall, slender beings whose movements carried the precision of species memory spanning millions of years. They regarded him with expressions that mixed curiosity, disdain, and something else. Fear. Eldrad awaited him in a chamber whose walls displayed the webway's infinite branches. The Forsayer was ancient even by Eldar standards, over 10,000 years old, his psychic presence so vast it made Tigurius seem like a candle next to a star. "You wonder why we brought you here," Eldrad said, gesturing at the walls. The displays shifted, showing timelines, futures branching like infinite trees. "I have walked the paths of fate since before your species learned to shape metal. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have witnessed the birth of gods and the death of realities." The display focused on a single thread, burning blue and red, cutting through established futures like a blade through silk. "You should not exist here. Your arrival violated causality in ways that have created complications." Eldred's hands moved and the timelines shifted. "Observe, in 87% of probable futures, the Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan consumes the galaxy within 3 centuries. In 9%, chaos achieves full manifestation and reality becomes eternal nightmare. In 3%, the Necrons awaken fully and exterminate all organic life. In the remaining 1%, he paused, his ancient eyes meeting Clark's. The remaining 1% are so improbable, so dependent on variables that should not exist, that I dismissed them as statistical noise, until you arrived." The display showed futures where Clark stood at critical junctures. Worlds saved that should have fallen, battles won that should have been lost, and threading through them all, a slim possibility, less than 0.01%, where the galaxy's death spiral slowed, not stopped, not reversed, but slowed. "You represent hope," Eldred said, and his tone made it sound like a curse. "Not false hope, not the Imperium's desperate faith or the Tau's naive optimism. Genuine hope, the possibility that outcomes are not predetermined, that even in a dying galaxy, individual choice matters." "That sounds like a good thing," Clark replied carefully. "It terrifies me," Eldrad admitted. "Hope is the most dangerous force in the universe. It makes beings attempt the impossible. It leads to catastrophic failures when reality inevitably reasserts itself. The Eldar learned this lesson when we birthed Slaanesh through our hubris. We hoped we could indulge ourselves eternally without consequence. That hope damned our entire species." The Farseer moved closer, and Clark felt the weight of his psychic presence, not attacking, but analyzing, seeing through him in ways that made even X-ray vision seem superficial. "I brought you here to show you why hope fails, to demonstrate the mathematical certainty of entropy's victory, to convince you to stop fighting, to accept the inevitable, before your actions create worse catastrophes than the ones you prevent." The walls exploded with visions. Clark saw futures where his intervention on Thessia Prime caused the Orcs to seek greater challenges, leading them to attack more heavily defended worlds, escalating conflicts that killed billions. He saw the 27 children he'd saved from Quintus Severon. In 63% of futures, they became possessed again because the demon taint hadn't been fully purged. In 17%, they grew to become inquisitors who implemented even harsher purge protocols, having learned mercy's cost. In 12%, they simply died young from psychic trauma. He saw his alliance with Vex strengthening the Inquisition's power, leading to 17 new exterminatus protocols across worlds that might have been saved through other means. He saw the Tau using his visit as propaganda, emboldening expansion campaigns that brought them into direct conflict with Imperium forces, sparking wars that consumed trillions. Every action, every choice, rippling outward into catastrophe. "Do you see?" Eldrad asked quietly. "This is why I have spent 10,000 years trying to guide fate toward least terrible outcomes. Because every attempt to make things better risks making them catastrophically worse. Your heroism, your compassion, your refusal to accept necessity, these qualities doom as many as they save." Clark stared at the futures, feeling the weight of them pressing down like a physical force. It was Trazen's nihilism given mathematical proof, the universe itself demonstrating that hope was delusion. "Why show me this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Why not just kill me if I'm so dangerous?" "Because in 0.083% of futures, you do something I cannot predict." Eldrad's expression was unreadable. Your existence outside our reality's normal causality creates blind spots in my precognition. You represent quantum uncertainty given form, and in some of those unpredictable futures, he paused. In some of them, the galaxy survives. I don't know how. I can't see the mechanism, but the possibility exists. The Farseer's hands moved again, and the visions collapsed into a single image. Clark, standing at a crossroads. One path led to him accepting the 41st millennium's brutal logic, becoming a weapon for the Imperium. Another showed him broken by impossible choices, corrupted by chaos through the simple expedient of offering him power to save everyone. A third showed him retreating from conflict entirely, preserving his morality by refusing to act. And a fourth path, barely visible, shrouded in uncertainty, showed something else, something Eldrad couldn't see clearly. I am giving you a choice, the Farseer said. I can send you home, back to your Earth, your reality, where heroism is possible and hope is not delusion. It will cost me dearly. The psychic energy required to breach dimensional barriers of this magnitude will reduce my remaining lifespan by centuries. But I will do it, because your presence here introduces too many variables, too much chaos masquerading as hope. Clark felt his heart skip. Home, Earth, Lois, Ma, and Pa, the Justice League. A world where Superman meant something uncomplicated, where saving people didn't require calculating acceptable casualties, where mercy wasn't heresy. Or, Eldred continued, you can stay, except that your actions will cause as much harm as good, that you will fail more often than you succeed, that in the end, entropy still wins. But stay anyway, because in those 0.083% of unpredictable futures, something changes, something I cannot see, something that might matter. Why would you offer that? Clark asked. If I'm so dangerous? Because I am 10,000 years old and I am tired of being right. Eldrad's voice carried profound weariness. I have optimized the Eldar's survival for millennia, sacrificed billions to save trillions, made every cold, logical choice fate demanded, and we still decline. Still march toward extinction, one optimized decision at a time. The ancient Farseer looked at Clark with something approaching envy. You don't think like we do. Don't calculate probabilities and choose least terrible outcomes. You simply act, believing it will matter, despite all evidence to the contrary. It's foolish, irrational, statistically catastrophic. He smiled, a sad ancient expression. And yet in 0.083% of futures, that foolishness changes everything. So I offer you the choice I have never offered myself. Surrender to logic and return home, or embrace uncertainty and stay. Clark looked at the past before him. Home beckoned with familiar warmth. Here waited only darkness, impossible choices, and the certainty that his heroism would cause cascading harm. Trazyn had told him the galaxy was dying. Vex had shown him that cruelty was sometimes necessary. The orcs had proven violence was often the only answer. And now Eldrad demonstrated mathematically that hope itself was dangerous. Every rational consideration said, go home, except that this galaxy was beyond saving, that his presence caused more harm than good, that some problems had no solutions. But Clark remembered something his father, Jonathan Kent, had once told him. It's not about winning every time, son. It's about standing up every time, because the day you stop trying is the day you stop being you. He thought about the 27 children from Quintus Severon. Maybe they'd be possessed again. Maybe they'd become brutal inquisitors. Maybe they'd die young. Or maybe, in some unpredictable future, one of them would become something else, something better. Someone who'd remember that a man in a blue suit had refused to give up on them when the entire galaxy said they should die. I'm staying, Clark said. Eldred's expression didn't change, but something in his psychic presence shifted. Relief? Approval? Fear? Then you are either the most courageous being I have encountered in 10 millennia, the Farseer said slowly, or the most foolish. Possibly both. Probably both, Clark agreed. But that's what hope is, isn't it? acting despite the odds, trying despite the math, believing that individual choices matter even when the universe says they don't. And you think that's strength? I think it's the only strength that matters. Clark met the ancient Farseer's gaze. You've spent 10,000 years optimizing survival. How's that working out? Are the Eldar thriving? Is the galaxy becoming safer? Or are you just managing the speed of decline? Eldred was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. 0.083%, he said. That's all the probability I can assign to your path succeeding, but I suppose that's 0.083% more than we had before you arrived. The Farseer gestured, and the webway opened. Go then, man of tomorrow. Forge your path. Make your impossible choices. Save those you can and live with those you can't. And perhaps, in that point, 0.083% of futures, your foolishness will prove wiser than my 10,000 years of calculated certainty. As Clark prepared to step back into the webway, Eldred spoke once more. For what it's worth, Kal-El, I hope you succeed. Hope is not something I have felt in a very long time. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like. Clark nodded and stepped through. Behind him, the ancient Farseer watched the unpredictable future unfold, and for the first time in millennia, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, being wrong would be the best thing that ever happened. The distress signal reached Clark 3 weeks after his meeting with Eldrad. It came not through Imperial Vox channels, but through something more primal. Screams carried on psychic wavelengths that his Kryptonian hearing translated into audible terror. A world dying not through invasion or corruption, but through consumption. Tyranids. Clark had studied the hive fleets during his time with the Inquisition, the Great Devourer. Extragalactic horrors that existed only to consume biomass and evolve. They felt no hatred, no malice, no emotion whatsoever. They were hunger given form, a biological imperative that reduced entire ecosystems to bare rock before moving to the next meal. The world of Meridian's Hope, a mining colony of 12 million, had 5 days before Hive Fleet Jormungandr's vanguard organisms stripped it clean. Inquisitor Vex's voice crackled over the Vox, strained in ways that suggested she'd already written the world off. We can't save them, Clark. The Tyranid advance is absolute. Imperial Guard forces are evacuating critical personnel, approximately 300,000. Everyone else, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. 300,000 out of 12 million, Clark repeated. What about the rest? They die. We deny the Tyranids their biomass by virus bombing the planet after evacuation completes. 11.7 million corpses consumed by the Imperium rather than feeding the swarm. It's the only way to slow them. Clark was already moving before Vex finished speaking. Tell your forces to keep evacuating. I'm buying you time. Clark, no. You don't understand. The Tyranids don't negotiate. They don't retreat. They don't care about your power. They'll just adapt and consume you like they consume everything else. You can't. He cut the Vox link. Meridian's Hope appeared below him, a world of gray stone and industrial structures. The northern continent was already gone, reduced to bare bedrock by the Tyranid swarm. The southern continent, where the remaining population had fortified themselves, was under siege by creatures that defied classification. Hormagaunts, swift hunter organisms, swarmed in millions. Carnifexes, living siege engines, smashed through fortifications like they were paper. Tyranid warriors, synapse creatures that directed the swarm's tactics, coordinated the assault with hive mind precision. And above it all, the bioships orbited, birthing more organisms, evolving new adaptations, processing consumed biomass into fuel for further conquest. Clark hit the swarm at supersonic speed. His first pass vaporized thousands of hormagaunts, his heat vision carving corridors through chitin and bioacid. His freeze breath created barriers of frozen organisms that the swarm simply climbed over, using their dead as stepping stones. His strength pulverized carnifexes into component molecules, and the hive mind observed, analyzed, adapted. The second wave came at him different. Organisms with mirrored carapaces that reflected his heat vision. Creatures whose internal biology could survive absolute zero temperatures by entering metabolic stasis. Warriors whose armor incorporated materials specifically evolved to resist kinetic impacts. They'd adapted to him in minutes. Clark fought for 3 hours straight. His Kryptonian cells burned solar energy faster than Meridian's sun could replenish it. Every organism he destroyed was replaced by 3 more. Every adaptation he overcame triggered new evolutionary responses. A hive tyrant, a massive command organism, emerged from a bioship. It carried weapons that spat crystallized toxins specifically designed to affect Kryptonian cellular structure. The hive mind had analyzed his biology during the fight, extrapolated weaknesses, and engineered a counter. The toxin hit Clark's shoulder, burning through his uniform and into his flesh. Pain, real, burning pain, flooded his nervous system. Not enough to incapacitate, but enough to prove the terrible truth. The Tyranids could kill him. Would kill him if he stayed long enough. All they needed was time to evolve the perfect counter. But Clark wasn't trying to win. He was buying time. He shifted tactics. Instead of fighting the swarm directly, he began destroying the bioships. His speed carried him into orbit faster than the Tyranid fleet could respond. His heat vision, focused to pinpoint intensity, carved through organic hulls. His strength tore through the ship's internal structures. One ship fell, then another, then 5 more. But there were hundreds, and for every ship he destroyed, the hive mind learned. Bioships began generating electrical fields that interfered with his flight. Spawned flying organisms, gargoyles that swarmed him in clouds so thick they blocked his solar energy absorption, adapted their hulls to dissipate heat, to flex rather than shatter under kinetic impact. Clark was losing. He knew it. The hive mind knew it. But he'd bought time. 8 hours of time. 8 hours for the Imperial evacuation to save not 300,000, but 470,000. As his strength waned, as toxins accumulated in his system faster than his metabolism could purge them, Clark made a decision that would have horrified the version of himself who'd arrived in this galaxy. He led the swarm away from the planet, used himself as bait, drawing millions of organisms into pursuit. They followed, because the hive mind had determined he represented valuable genetic material. Adapting to his capabilities would make the swarm stronger. Consuming his biomass would provide evolutionary templates for future battles. Clark led them on a chase through the void, away from Meridian's hope, toward the system's outer planets. Behind him, the Imperial evacuation fleet completed its mission and fled into warp space. Then the virus bombs detonated. Meridian's hope's atmosphere ignited, the flesh-eating virus consuming everything biological. The 11.3 million people who hadn't been evacuated died instantly, their biomass denied to the Tyranids, their sacrifice buying time for other worlds. Clark floated in the void, watching the planet die, and felt something inside him break. He'd saved 470,000 people, had condemned 11.3 million. The math was identical to Quintus Severon, to the orphanage, to every impossible choice this galaxy had forced on him. Save some, lose most, call it victory. The Tyranid swarm surrounded him, millions of organisms in the void, waiting for orders from the hive mind. Clark could feel them analyzing him, their collective intelligence trying to determine whether he was worth the resources required to kill and consume. Then impossibly they stopped. The swarm simply held position, not retreating, not attacking, just observing. Through methods he didn't understand, Clark felt the hive mind's attention focus on him. Not individual thoughts. Tyranids didn't have those, but a collective assessment, a judgment, inefficient. Target expends excessive biomass to preserve units already deemed consumed. Probability of successful harvest, declining. Resource expenditure, increasing. Conclusion, pursue more efficient feeding grounds. The swarm turned away, simply turned away, dismissing him as not worth the cost. They left the system entirely, moving toward worlds where the populations hadn't been evacuated, where consumption would be easier, more efficient. Clark had become too expensive to eat. He returned to Meridian's hope, to the gray, lifeless rock it had become, floated above what had been cities, factories, homes. 12 million people had lived here yesterday. Now there was nothing. just stone and ash, and the molecular residue of a virus that killed so efficiently it made the Tyranids seem merciful. Inquisitor Vex's fleet returned hours later. She found Clark sitting on the planet's surface, staring at nothing. 470,000, she said, sitting beside him despite her power armor, making the gesture awkward. You saved 470,000 people who would have died otherwise. That's a victory, Clark. 11.3 million died, he replied. I could hear them, could hear their screams on psychic wavelengths as the virus ate them alive. They prayed to the Emperor. Some prayed to me. None of their prayers were answered. No, they weren't. Vex didn't offer comfort, didn't try to make it better. This is what fighting the Tyranids means. They don't corrupt like chaos. They don't oppress like empires. They just consume. Utterly, completely. And all we can do is slow them, deny them biomass, buy time measured in the tens of millions of dead. She stood, offered her hand. But those 470,000, they're alive because you fought. Their children will live. Their grandchildren. Entire family lines continuing because you refused to accept that all 12 million had to die. Clark didn't take her hand. Couldn't find the strength. Eldred was right, he said quietly. My hope just makes the suffering more efficient. I give people false belief they might survive, so they fight harder, buy more time, die more heroically. I'm not saving anyone. I'm just optimizing how quickly they die serving someone else's calculations. Then why are you still here? Vex asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Eldrad offered you escape, return to your Earth. You could have taken it. I don't know, Clark admitted. And for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, that was true. He didn't know why he stayed, didn't know what he thought he could accomplish, didn't know if anything he did mattered at all. Vex studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She removed her helmet, revealing the face beneath, scarred, augmented, but still recognizably human, still capable of expression. I lost my sister to a Genestealer cult when I was 19, she said. Could have saved her, had the shot. But I hesitated because she begged me to, because she said there was still hope she could be freed. By the time I pulled the trigger, 17 other people were infected. I've spent 41 years making sure I never hesitate again. Never hope when hope kills. She met his eyes. But you know what keeps me going? It's not the Emperor, not duty, not even survival. It's the memory of my sister's face. Before the corruption. The memory that once something in this galaxy was worth saving. You're that memory made real, Clark. Living proof that beings can still choose compassion, even when logic demands cruelty. And as long as you exist, as long as you keep trying, the rest of us can remember why we fight beyond just preventing extinction. She replaced her helmet. So no, you're not optimizing our deaths. You're reminding us what we're dying for. That matters, even when, especially when, you don't believe it yourself. Clark finally took her hand and stood. His body ached from toxins and energy depletion. His soul ached worse. But he stood. Because that's what he did. Even when it didn't matter. Even when hope was delusion. Even when every calculation said his efforts were futile. He stood anyway. The call came from Cadia, the fortress world. The world that had stood sentinel against the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. The world whose regiments were legendary across the Imperium. Where every citizen was a soldier. Where children learned to field-strip lace guns before they learned to read. Cadia was falling, not to a conventional invasion, not to chaos forces that could be repelled with tactics and firepower. Cadia was falling because Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, commander of the Black Legion, architect of 13 failed Black Crusades, had finally succeeded. He was dropping the Blackstone Fortress onto the planet. Clark received the Vox transmission while still recovering on his Space Hulk. Inquisitor Vex's voice carried an emotion he'd never heard from her before. Despair. The pylons are failing. The structures that have kept the Eye of Terror stable for millennia. Abaddon's destroying them, systematically. When Cadia falls, the Great Rift will tear the galaxy in half. Trillions will die. Hundreds of sectors will be consumed by warp storms. The Imperium as we know it will fracture beyond recovery. How long? Clark asked. The Blackstone Fortress impacts in 19 hours. Even if we evacuate everyone we can, when that moon-sized construct hits Cadia's surface, the planet will crack apart. 3 billion people, gone. And with them, the only thing holding back the Imperium's complete collapse. Clark was moving before she finished. I'm coming. Clark, no, you can't stop this. Even the Emperor himself couldn't stop a Blackstone fortress. You'll die for nothing. Then I died trying. The flight to Cadia took every ounce of speed Clark could muster. He pushed himself beyond safety margins, burning through solar energy reserves, phasing in and out of real space to achieve velocities that should have torn him apart. He arrived to witness hell. The space around Cadia was a war zone beyond comprehension. Imperial Navy battleships traded fire with Chaos fleets spanning thousands of kilometers. Space Marine chapters from across the Imperium, Ultramarines, Black Templars, Space Wolves, Blood Angels, fought boarding actions against traitor forces. The skies above Cadia burned with the debris of destroyed spacecraft, and descending through it all, inevitable as gravity itself, came the Blackstone Fortress. It was a structure from an age before humanity, Xenos technology from the war in heaven, corrupted by chaos, weaponized by Abaddon, kilometers long, bristling with weapons that could destroy stars, powered by energies that made warp drives look like children's toys. Clark intercepted it at the upper atmosphere. He hit the fortress at his maximum speed, channeling every joule of energy his cells contained into a single strike. The impact created a shockwave visible from space. The fortress's trajectory shifted by 0.003 degrees. Not enough, not nearly enough. He tried again and again, each impact shifting the trajectory microscopically, each strike depleting his reserves further. Around him, Imperial forces recognized what he was attempting and rallied. Space Marine Thunderhawks joined him, firing everything they had at critical points he'd weakened. Navy bombers made suicide runs, their pilots ramming explosives into structural weak points. It wasn't working. The fortress had too much mass, too much momentum. Stopping it would require force beyond anything Clark possessed, beyond anything the assembled Imperial forces possessed. Then a new presence entered the battlefield, a golden light burning brighter than any sun Clark had ever seen. A psychic presence so vast it made Eldrad seem insignificant. Power that resonated across real space and warp space simultaneously. The Emperor's consciousness, projected from Holy Terra itself, channeled through thousands of psychers who burned out their souls to serve as conduits. And in that moment, Clark understood something fundamental about the 41st millennium. The God Emperor of mankind wasn't dead, wasn't truly imprisoned on his golden throne. He was conscious, aware, fighting a war in the warp so terrible that if he stopped for even an instant, chaos would consume everything. Every daemon banished, every warp storm calmed, every psyker protected from possession. 10,000 years of constant, unending battle to hold back the tide. The Emperor's attention focused on Clark, and it was like being seen by the sun itself. You are not of this reality, not of this timeline. Yet you fight for my people. Clark felt the words resonate in his soul, felt the Emperor analyzing him, seeing everything he was, everything he'd done, every choice he'd made since arriving. You doubt, you question, you refuse absolute certainty even when certainty would be easier. This is unexpected, refreshing, perhaps even necessary. The golden light intensified and Clark felt power flowing into him, not changing him, not corrupting him, simply amplifying what he already was. The Emperor's will aligned with his own for a single, perfect moment. Strike now, last son, not alone. Together. Clark didn't question, didn't hesitate. He gathered every ounce of his enhanced strength, channeled every photon of solar radiation his cells could process, and struck the Blackstone Fortress one final time. The Emperor's psychic might struck simultaneously. The fortress's trajectory shifted. Not enough to miss Cadia entirely. That was impossible now. but enough to change the impact vector from planet killer to catastrophic but survivable. The Blackstone Fortress hit Cadia's northern pole at an angle that sheared off 3 continents, but left the planet's core intact. The impact killed approximately 1.8 billion people instantly. Cadia's axis tilted 37 degrees. Tectonic plates shattered. Oceans vaporized. But the planet held. Barely. Broken. Burning. But held. The Emperor's presence withdrew, the golden light fading as thousands of psychers across the Imperium collapsed, their souls burned to ash by channeling such power. But before he withdrew completely, Clark felt one final message. You asked if hope matters in this galaxy, if individual choice can change predetermined outcomes. Today you have your answer. 0.083% possibility became reality because you refused to accept inevitability. Remember this, when darkness threatens to consume you. Then he was gone. Clark floated in space above dying Cadia, his power completely depleted, his body running on reserves he didn't know he had. Below, Imperial forces began desperate evacuation protocols. 1.2 billion survivors. Out of 3 billion. Abaddon's voice boomed across all Vox channels, amplified by chaos sorcery. Cadia stands. Let Cadia stand then. Broken, bleeding, a monument to the Imperium's failure. The galaxy splits tonight. The great rift opens, and your precious Emperor's light will never reach half his realm again. The War Master of Chaos was right. Even with Cadia surviving, the pylons had failed. The Eye of Terror expanded, tearing a wound across the galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a warp storm stretching from one side of known space to the other, bisecting the Imperium, cutting off worlds from Holy Terra's light. The 41st millennium had just become darker, but Cadia stood. Broken, yes. Dying, certainly. But standing. And 1.2 billion people lived who should have died. Inquisitor Vex's ship found Clark drifting near Cadia's upper atmosphere, barely conscious. They pulled him aboard, and he awoke in the Medigi base surrounded by stormtroopers, space marines, and Vex herself. You did it, she said, and her voice carried something Clark had never heard from her before. Wonder. You actually did it. The mathematicians said it was impossible. The Farseers said every path led to Cadia's complete destruction. But you changed it. Not me, Clark rasped. The Emperor focused his attention here because you were here, because your presence created a probability he could exploit. Vex leaned closer. Do you understand what this means? You didn't save everyone, didn't prevent the Great Rift, didn't stop the darkness, but you proved that outcomes aren't predetermined, that even in the 41st millennium's nightmare logic, individual choice can shift impossible odds. She stood, and Clark saw other figures entering the Medigi Bay, representatives from a dozen Space Marine chapters, Imperial Guard command staff, even a delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus. They regarded him with expressions ranging from suspicion to respect to something approaching reverence. A Space Marine captain, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines himself, spoke. The High Lords of Terra have been informed of your actions. They debate what you represent. Sanctioned Xenos, unpredictable variable, potential heresy, he paused, or the Emperor's providence given form. Calgar removed his helmet, revealing a face that had seen centuries of warfare. I fought beside you today, watched you refuse to accept Cadia's death, even when every tactical analysis said it was inevitable. That is not heresy. That is the most human thing I have witnessed in 200 years of service. He clasped his fist to his chest, the Aquila salute. Cadia stands because you stood. The galaxy fractures, but the Imperium survives. That is victory enough for this dark age. The other Space Marines followed suit, then the Guard officers. Then, slowly, Inquisitor Vex herself. Clark sat up despite his body's protests. I didn't do this for recognition. I didn't do it for the Imperium. I did it because 3 billion people deserved a chance. Because hope, even irrational, mathematically impossible hope, is worth fighting for. Then you are either blessed or damned, Calgar replied. Time will tell which. But today you are a hero, perhaps the only true hero this galaxy has seen in 10,000 years. Clark wanted to reject that, wanted to point out the 1.8 billion who died, the great rift that had still formed, the countless failures shadowing this single success. But looking at the faces around him, these warriors who'd spent lifetimes fighting impossible odds, who'd sacrificed everything for a galaxy that gave nothing back, he saw something he'd rarely seen in the 41st millennium. Hope, not the desperate, brittle hope of the doomed, but genuine, impossible, irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. That maybe one being's refusal to accept inevitability could change everything. Clark didn't know if that was true, didn't know if his 0.083% of unpredictable futures would amount to anything, didn't know if he just delayed catastrophe or genuinely changed trajectory. But for the first time since arriving in this nightmare galaxy, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. He felt like Superman. 6 months after Cadia, Clark stood on the observation deck of his Space Hulk sanctuary, watching the Great Rift tear across the galaxy like a wound that would never heal. The cicatrix maledictum pulsed with colors that existed only in nightmares, bisecting the Imperium, plunging half the galaxy into a darkness even the Astronomican's light couldn't penetrate. The 41st millennium had become the 42nd, and the new millennium was darker than the old. But darkness wasn't absolute. Clark's sanctuary had grown. What began as a refuge for 27 children now housed 17,000 souls. Refugees from worlds torn apart by the Great Rift. Imperial Guard soldiers deemed unfit for service due to injuries that hadn't killed them. Tech priests excommunicated for questioning Mechanicus doctrine. Even a few Eldar Rangers who'd found his sanctuary preferable to their dying craft worlds. It was chaos. It was inefficient by Imperial standards. It violated 1,700 regulations and probably constituted heresy under at least 43 different interpretations of Imperial law. It was also the first place in the 41st millennium where people from different factions lived together without killing each other. Inquisitor Vex visited regularly, officially to monitor potential Xenos infiltration, unofficially to drink recaf in Clark's quarters and talk about cases that troubled her. She'd softened, not much, but enough to question orders before executing them, enough to try evacuation before exterminatus, enough to remember that mercy carefully applied wasn't always weakness. The 27 children from Quintus Severin were teenagers now. 3 had shown psychic potential and were training with a sanctioned psyker Clark had recruited, learning to control their gifts without the brutal conditioning of the Imperium's black ships. 2 had died from complications related to their earlier possession, their funerals attended by humans and Eldar alike. The rest were simply living, learning, hoping. Clark's Vox terminal chimed, a priority message from Captain Ventress of the Ultramarines. Clark, we have a situation on Vigilus. Massive Xenos incursion, orcs, Genestealer cults, and reports of Necron tomb awakening. The system's defenses are failing. We need... He paused. We need Superman. Superman. The name had spread across Imperial space like wildfire. To some, a title of respect. To others, blasphemy. Humanity needed no supermen, only faith in the Emperor. The ecclesiarchy debated whether he was a living saint or demon in disguise. The Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus had declared him provisionally tolerated pending further observation. But to the soldiers fighting impossible odds, to the civilians trapped in war zones, to the forgotten and discarded across a fractured galaxy, he was hope. Clark keyed the Vox. I'm on my way. He'd learned so much since arriving. Learned that the Imperium's cruelty came from 10,000 years of trauma, not inherent evil. Learned that the Tau's manipulation emerged from desperate pragmatism, not malicious control. Learned that even chaos offered truths wrapped in lies, and that the Tyranids represented not malice, but the universe's indifference given form. He'd learned that in the 41st millennium, there were no good choices, only terrible ones and catastrophic ones. That mercy often killed and cruelty sometimes saved. That hope could be weaponized and despair could be survival instinct. But he'd also learned something else. Individual choices still mattered. When he'd fought beside the Ultramarines on Quintus Severin, when he'd bought time for evacuations on Meridian's Hope, when he'd refused to accept Cadia's death, those choices had created ripples. Small ripples in an ocean of darkness, yes, but ripples nonetheless. Eldrad's 0.083% of unpredictable futures wasn't much, but it was more than zero. And zero was what the galaxy had before he arrived. Clark suited up, his uniform repaired and reinforced with materials from a dozen different sources: ultramarine ceramite, tau nanoweave, even a few threads of Eldar wraithbone, gifts from rangers who'd witnessed his sanctuary and deemed it an interesting experiment in cultural integration. He looked like Superman again, battered, scarred, but still recognizably the hero from another universe who'd refused to surrender his values even when the entire galaxy demanded it. As he prepared to launch toward Vigilus, one of the Quintus Severin survivors, a young woman named Arya, who'd been 7 when he'd saved her, approached. She'd grown into someone fierce, training with both Imperial Guard veterans and Eldar Rangers, learning to fight in ways that blended human determination with Xeno's precision. "You're leaving again," she said, not accusatory, just observational. "Vigilus needs help. The galaxy always needs help. You can't save everyone." "No," Clark agreed, "but I can save some, and some is better than none." Arya smiled, a genuine expression uncomplicated by the 41st millennium's darkness. "That's what you told us. When we thought we were damned, when the demons were still whispering, you said some of you will make it, and that's enough reason to try. We believed you. Against all logic, we believed you." She handed him something, a piece of metal salvaged from Cadia's debris, shaped and polished by tech priests in his sanctuary. It bore a symbol, the stylized S of his chest emblem, surrounded by the Imperial Aquila, flanked by Tau script and Eldar runes. "What is this?" Clark asked. "Your symbol. Your hope." Arya's expression turned serious. "You showed us that different factions can cooperate. That mercy isn't always weakness. That choosing compassion in a cruel galaxy isn't naivety. It's the hardest, bravest thing anyone can do. We needed that lesson. The galaxy needs it." Clark looked at the symbol, feeling its weight. Not physical weight. It was barely 30 grams of metal. But the weight of what it represented, proof that in the darkest timeline humanity had ever known, hope could still take root and grow. "The Imperium will eventually destroy this place," Arya continued, "or chaos will corrupt it, or the Tyranids will devour it. Entropy wins, right? Everything ends. But before it does, we existed. We proved something different was possible. That has to count for something." Clark closed his hand around the symbol. "It counts for everything." He launched toward Vigilus, accelerating to speeds that bent light around him. Behind him, his sanctuary, his drop in an ocean of suffering, continued its impossible existence. Humans and Eldar sharing meals, tech priests and children learning together. Soldiers from enemy factions discovering they weren't so different after all. It wouldn't last. The 41st millennium didn't permit such things to last, but while it existed, it mattered. Clark arrived at Vigilus to find 3 Space Marine chapters, 17 Imperial Guard regiments, and a Titan Legion holding the line against odds that should have been insurmountable. When he descended from the sky, trailing solar fire like a comet, he saw what he'd rarely seen in this galaxy: soldiers looking up with expressions of relief, of hope, of belief that maybe, impossibly, they'd survive this. "Superman's here!" someone shouted, and the cry spread across the battlefield like wildfire. Captain Ventress greeted him on the command deck, his ancient armor scarred from centuries of war. "Glad you could make it. The situation's deteriorating faster than projected. We're looking at complete planetary loss within 72 hours. "Then we have 72 hours to prove the calculations wrong," Clark replied. Ventress's expression, difficult to read beneath his helmet, shifted. "You know, when I first encountered you, I thought you were delusional, refusing to accept reality's constraints, believing compassion mattered in a galaxy built on necessary cruelty." He gestured at the hololithic display showing Vigilus's desperate defenders. "But watching you fight, Watching how soldiers respond when they believe someone actually cares whether they survive, I'm starting to understand. Understand what? That the Emperor's vision, when he first unified humanity before the heresy broke everything, might have looked like what you're trying to build. A galaxy where strength served protection rather than domination, where different beings cooperated rather than merely tolerated each other's existence. Ventress clasped Clark's shoulder. It failed then. Will probably fail again. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is trying anyway. Clark nodded. Maybe it is. They fought for Vigilus, fought for 72 hours that stretched into a week, then two. Clark was everywhere, shielding soldiers from orc fire, rescuing civilians from Genestealer tunnels, even negotiating temporary truces with Necron cryptechs who found the concept of a superpowered alien choosing to protect humans sufficiently fascinating to pause their awakening protocols. He didn't save everyone, didn't prevent all casualties, didn't transform Vigilus into paradise, but he saved enough. When the reinforcements finally arrived, a full battle group led by Primarch Robota Gilliman himself returned from stasis to lead the Imperium in its darkest hour. Vigilus still stood, battered, bleeding, but standing. Gilliman, Gene Father of the Ultramarines, one of the Emperor's 20 Primarchs, a demigod walking among mortals, studied Clark with eyes that had witnessed the Imperium's birth and mourned its decay. "You are an anomaly," the Primarch said, his voice carrying authority that made even Space Marines straighten. "An impossible variable in equations I've spent 10,000 years solving. You shouldn't exist. Your methods shouldn't work. Yet here stands Vigilus. Here live soldiers who should have died. Here exists hope in a galaxy I thought had forgotten the concept." Gilliman leaned closer, and Clark saw something in the Primarch's expression. Not suspicion, not hostility, but cautious, fragile possibility. "My father created 20 suns to conquer the galaxy. I am the last loyalist still active, the last of his grand vision still fighting his wars. And in 10,000 years, we've achieved nothing but survival through suffering." Gilliman's voice dropped. Perhaps, perhaps that vision was always insufficient. Perhaps what this galaxy needs isn't more warriors or better tactics. Perhaps it needs what you represent. Irrational, impossible, mathematically inadvisable hope. The Primarch extended his hand, a gesture of equals. "Fight with us, Kal-El of Krypton. Not for us, not under us, with us. Show the Imperium that our father's vision can evolve, that even in this dark millennium, we can become something better than merely efficient at managing decline." Clark clasped the Primarch's hand, and in that moment felt the weight of 10,000 years of history shifting, not ending, not solving, but shifting, towards something that might, impossibly irrationally against all calculations, be better. "Together then," Clark said, "for as long as hope matters, for as long as individual choices can change outcomes, for as long as we can believe that 0.083% is enough." Gilliman's expression, so rarely given to emotion, shifted into something like a smile. 0.083%, the Primarch repeated. "In 10,000 years, I've led campaigns with worse odds than that. Welcome to the Indomitus Crusade, Superman. Let's prove the mathematicians wrong. In the 41st millennium, there is only war. This truth remained unchanged. The Great Rift scarred the galaxy. Chaos spread. The Tyranids hungered. The Necrons awakened. Entropy's victory was still inevitable, still mathematical, still certain. But certainty had a crack in it now. Clark Kent, Superman, the last son of Krypton, the man of tomorrow, existed as that crack, a being from a universe where heroes saved the day, now operating in a timeline where heroes were ground to dust. He learned the 41st millennium's brutal lessons, understood that his compassion killed as often as it saved, accepted that hope could be weaponized, and mercy often meant prolonging suffering. Yet he continued anyway. His sanctuary grew despite impossibility. His reputation spread despite heresy accusations. Soldiers fought harder knowing he watched. Commanders tried evacuation before exterminatus. Even inquisitors occasionally hesitated before executing the condemned. Were these changes significant? Eldred's calculations suggested not. Even with Clark's interventions, the galaxy still declined toward heat death. The Imperium still fractured. Chaos still advanced. All the math remained unchanged, but Eldred himself had admitted being tired of being right. Perhaps that's what hope meant in the 41st millennium. Not belief in victory, but refusal to accept predetermined defeat. Not naive optimism, but conscious choice to struggle, despite knowing the struggle was futile. Clark had asked himself 1,000 times since arriving, did individual choices matter in a universe built to crush individuality? The answer, he'd finally realized, was that asking the question was itself the answer. Because in a galaxy where asking that question was heresy, where compassion was weakness, where hope was delusion, the very act of continuing to ask, continuing to try, continuing to believe became an act of revolution. He would fail more than he succeeded, would save minorities while majorities died, would make decisions that haunted him and choices that cascaded into catastrophe. The 41st millennium would not be saved, could not be saved, but it could be changed. Microscopically, improbably, irrationally, and sometimes in 0.083% of futures that even Eldar farseers couldn't fully predict. Those microscopic, improbable, irrational changes would compound into something larger. Not salvation, not victory, not paradise, but possibility. The possibility that a space marine might spare a civilian, that an inquisitor might try rehabilitation before execution, that a human might see an Eldar as an ally, rather than Xenos filth, that 17,000 beings from enemy factions might live together on a salvaged space hulk and call it home. Small possibilities, fragile possibilities. Possibilities that would probably fail, but possibilities nonetheless. As Clark launched toward his next battle, toward another impossible choice, another terrible trade-off, another microscopic shift in outcomes, he carried with him the symbol Arya had given him, the blended iconography of Imperium, Tau, and Eldar, physical proof that different realities could intersect without annihilating each other. He was no longer the Superman who'd arrived 6 months ago, shocked by the 41st millennium's brutality. That version of himself had died with the children on Quintus Severin, had burned away on Meridian's hope, had shattered when Cadia broke. But something new had emerged from those deaths, something that understood suffering without surrendering to it, that accepted cruelty's necessity without celebrating it, that acknowledged hope's futility without abandoning it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war, but now there was also Superman, and that made all the difference, even when it didn't.